Before Esther could become the queen, who stood between her people and destruction, another queen had to stand before the same throne and say, no. Her refusal did not concern Esther, and Esther was nowhere near the palace when it happened. Yet that one unanswered command exposed something essential about the world Esther would later enter. This was a court where personal anger could become public policy and where the appearance of royal control mattered across an empire. The story begins in the reign of Ahasuerus, the king commonly identified with the Persian ruler Xerxes I. The Hebrew text places him over a vast territory extending from India to Kush, the region south of Egypt, and describes his dominion as 127 provinces. That number immediately widens the stage. Decisions made near the king would travel through many lands, languages, and peoples. A word issued from the palace was never simply a palace matter. It could be copied, translated, dispatched, and enforced at enormous distance. In the third year of his reign, Ahasuerus was at Susa, one of the principal royal centers of the Persian Empire. Susa lay far east of the old centers of Israel and Judah in what is now southwestern Iran. Its fortified royal complex was both residence and administrative center, a place where court ceremony and imperial government occupied the same space. The biblical story distinguishes this citadel from the wider city around it. Inside were guarded courts, royal apartments, officials, servants, records, and the machinery through which the king's will reached the provinces. Ahasuerus gathered the leading people of his realm for a banquet. The guests included his officials and servants, the military leadership of Persia and Media, nobles, and provincial governors. These were not casual visitors invited for an evening's entertainment. They represented the ranks through which imperial power functioned. Some commanded troops, some governed distant territories. Others depended directly on access to the king. Their presence concentrated much of the empire's authority in one place, around one throne. For 180 days, the king displayed what the text calls the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness. The account does not tell us that this long exhibition served one specific campaign or policy, so there is no need to invent one. Its visible purpose is clear enough. Ahasuerus wanted the empire's most powerful men to see the scale of what he possessed. Treasure, rank, ceremony, and duration all communicated that his resources seemed inexhaustible. 6 months is a long time to sustain a display. The length itself becomes part of the message. A ruler who can host officials for that period, occupy their attention, and continue presenting wealth is demonstrating more than personal luxury. He is showing the administrative reach that gathers them, the stores that supply them, and the hierarchy that keeps everyone arranged around him. The scene establishes Ahasuerus through abundance. Before he speaks a command in the story, his greatness has already been presented through what others are made to witness. When those 180 days ended, the king held another banquet lasting 7 days. This one was for all the people present in the citadel of Susa, from the greatest to the least. The wording lowers the social boundary without erasing rank. The people are still known as greater and lesser, but for this week they share access to the king's generosity. The celebration moves from a long display before imperial elites to a broad feast for those within the royal stronghold. It took place in the enclosed garden of the king's palace, a setting designed to impress at every level. White cotton curtains and violet hangings were fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars. The colors and materials belonged to wealth and status. The fabrics were not merely practical shade. They framed the gathering with the same deliberate magnificence that had shaped the previous months. Guests reclined on couches of gold and silver. Beneath them was a pavement composed of costly stone, porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other colored materials named in the Hebrew description. The exact identification of every stone is less important than the cumulative effect. Above, dyed fabrics were suspended from marble columns. Below, patterned stone reflected a range of colors and textures. Even the place where a guest sat or walked reinforced the wealth of the person hosting him. Wine was served in golden vessels, and the vessels were not uniform. Each was different from the others. That small detail makes the abundance more concrete. This was not one ceremonial cup passed from hand to hand, nor a collection produced to look identical. The variety suggested a treasury large enough to supply distinctive pieces throughout the banquet. Royal wine flowed freely, in keeping with the king's resources, yet the drinking followed an unusual rule. There was to be no compulsion. The king had instructed the officers of his household to allow each guest to drink according to his own desire. Banquets in royal settings could be governed by custom and expectation, including expectations about matching the host's drinking. Here, at least in this respect, the command from above created freedom below. Every guest could decide how much to drink. This detail does not make the Persian court informal. The freedom itself existed because the king ordered his servants to permit it. Even personal choice at the feast was organized through royal instruction. Officers had received a command about how they were not to command the guests. The arrangement fits the larger scene: abundance distributed through hierarchy, generosity administered through officials, and everything traced back to the will of Ahasuerus. While the men feasted in the palace garden, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for the women in the royal house belonging to King Ahasuerus. The text presents her as a royal host in her own sphere. She is not introduced through her ancestry, appearance, or private relationship with the king. She first appears exercising the role of queen, presiding over a gathering within the same palace complex while the king presides over his. The two banquets occur side by side, each orderly and each centered on a royal figure. The narrative does not describe conflict between Ahasuerus and Vashti before this moment. It does not tell us that she was already planning defiance, that she resented the feast, or that the marriage was troubled. As far as the Hebrew account takes us, the separation of the gatherings is simply the arrangement in place. The king with his guests, the queen with hers. Then came the seventh day. By that point, the banquet had run its full course, and the text says that the king's heart was merry with wine. Ahasuerus summoned 7 palace officials who served in his presence: Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass. They are identified as eunuchs, the kind of trusted court servants who could carry commands into protected areas of the royal household. The number and naming of the men give the order a distinctly official character. The king commanded them to bring Queen Vashti before him wearing the royal crown. He wanted to display her beauty to the peoples and officials gathered at the feast, because the text says she was beautiful to look at. After months of exhibiting royal wealth and a week of public generosity, Ahasuerus now intended to present the queen herself before his guests. She would enter not as the host of her own banquet, but as the object of the king's display. The command was precise in its essential points. Vashti was to leave the women's banquet, come through the palace under the escort of 7 royal servants, appear before the assembled men, and wear the crown that visibly marked her as queen. The crown linked her beauty to the king's status. She was not being summoned as an unknown woman whose appearance might please the room. She was being summoned as the queen whose position formed part of the glory Ahasuerus wished the room to see. Later retellings have often supplied details about what the command required or why Vashti resisted it. The Hebrew text does not say that she was ordered to appear naked, nor does it describe illness, disfigurement, modesty, political calculation, or any secret exchange between the royal couple. It gives the command, identifies its public purpose, and then reports her response. Any fuller motive belongs to later interpretation, not to the narrated event. Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. The refusal is brief because no speech accompanies it. She does not send back an argument that the reader is allowed to hear. She does not negotiate the terms of her appearance or offer to come later. The messengers carry the king's authority to her, and she does not obey it. Her silence leaves her reasons inaccessible, but it also keeps attention fixed on the fact that cannot be disputed. In a court built around compliance, the king has issued an order that has failed. For Ahasuerus, the failure was public, even though the refusal occurred elsewhere. His officials and guests were waiting for the queen to appear. The 7 servants had been sent out before them. They would have to return without her, and her absence would answer the command more visibly than a private disagreement ever could. The very size of the audience turned the moment into a challenge to the image the feast had spent so long constructing. Everything around the king had been arranged to demonstrate reach. Officials had come from across the empire. Wealth had been placed on display for 180 days. The garden had been dressed with royal colors and precious materials. Wine had been distributed through golden vessels according to rules set by the throne. Servants moved when commanded. Guests reclined where the palace had prepared places for them. Then the person wearing the royal crown declined to enter. That does not mean Vashti was attempting to overthrow the king, and the text never says that she was. It means her decision created a contradiction the court could not easily hide. Ahasuerus appeared able to command provinces from India to Kush, but he could not make the queen cross from one part of his palace to another. The contradiction became especially sharp because he had chosen this moment to display her as evidence of his greatness. The king reacted immediately. His anger burned within him. The narration does not slow down to describe a conversation between husband and wife, and Vashti does not appear again to explain herself. Attention remains with Ahasuerus in the banquet setting, surrounded by the men before whom his command has just failed. His anger is personal, but in this palace, personal anger has access to advisors, scribes, couriers, and law. A refusal that might have remained inside the royal household was therefore poised to travel far beyond it. The king had summoned Vashti because he wanted an audience to see her. Now that same audience had witnessed her absence, and the court would have to decide what that absence meant. Before Esther ever entered the royal house, its vacancy would begin with a feast, a command, and a queen who would not come. Ahasuerus turned at once to the men whose expertise could give his anger the force of judgment. The king's regular procedure, the text explains, was to consult wise men who understood the times and knew law and legal practice. These were not detached scholars asked to settle an abstract question. They were court authorities whose knowledge helped the throne interpret an offense, choose a response, and express that response in a form the empire could recognize as law. 7 princes of Persia and Media had privileged access to the king: Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan. They are described as men who saw the king's face and occupied the highest places in the kingdom. Seeing the king's face was a mark of access, not a casual observation. Royal presence was controlled. Those admitted near the sovereign possessed influence precisely because most people, including many officials, could not approach him directly. The king put the matter to this inner circle in legal terms. According to the law, he asked, what should be done to Queen Vashti because she had not obeyed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs? His wording preserved every element that made the refusal serious to him. It had been a royal command, transmitted through authorized servants, addressed to the queen, and left unfulfilled. He was not asking whether the command had been prudent. He was asking how the law should answer disobedience. That choice immediately changed the character of the dispute. There would be no private conversation with Vashti before a judgment was considered. at least none the account records. Her reasons remained outside the hearing, and no advocate spoke for her. The question passed directly from the offended king to men whose position depended on maintaining the order surrounding his throne. They were being asked to define the significance of an act that had embarrassed him in their presence. Memucan answered before the king and the other princes. Although he was listed last among the seven, he became the spokesman in this crisis. His response did not attempt to discover why Vashti refused. Instead, he enlarged the circle of those supposedly injured by her decision. Vashti, he argued, had wronged not only the king, but also every prince and all the peoples throughout the provinces of Ahasuerus. The claim was immense. One queen had declined one summons inside one palace. Yet Memucan described the offense as extending across the empire. His reasoning depended on the power of example. The women of the kingdom would hear what Vashti had done. They would learn that the king commanded her to be brought before him and that she did not come. Once they knew this, Memucan warned, they would look upon their own husbands with contempt. His prediction began at the top of society. That very day, he said, the noble women of Persia and Media who heard about the queen's conduct would speak in the same way to all the king's officials. The refusal would move from royal household to aristocratic household. Wives would cite or imitate Vashti. Husbands would experience her action as a challenge to their own standing. The result, in Memucan's words, would be contempt and wrath in abundance. The argument was effective because it translated the king's humiliation into the anxiety of every man listening. If Vashti had offended Ahasuerus alone, the advisors might merely be helping their ruler punish a personal slight. If her refusal threatened household authority throughout the governing class, then the princes themselves had something at stake. Memucan made the king's anger seem like the first instance of a danger that could soon reach them all. Nothing in the narrative shows that women across the provinces had heard about Vashti or were preparing to follow her. Memucan presented a forecast, not evidence of a spreading revolt. But court decisions do not always wait for the feared outcome to occur. By describing imitation as imminent, he supplied a reason for immediate and highly visible action. The response would need to travel at least as far as the example was expected to travel. Memucan therefore proposed that, if it pleased the king, a royal decree should go out from his presence. It was to be written among the laws of Persia and Media so that it could not be altered. Vashti would never again come before King Ahasuerus. This was more than a temporary exclusion from a banquet or a cooling period after an argument. Access to the king had defined her place as queen, and the decree would permanently deny that access. The Hebrew account does not say that Vashti was executed. It does not describe imprisonment, exile, or what became of her residence and attendants. Her stated punishment was removal from the king's presence, and after this decision, she disappears from the story. Later traditions offered various accounts of her end, but the biblical narrative leaves it there. What matters for the unfolding events is that the position beside Ahasuerus would no longer be hers. Memucan's proposal did not end with removal. He advised that the king give Vashti's royal position to another woman, one better than she. No candidate was yet named, and no search had begun. The phrase simply converted punishment into succession. Vashti's refusal had exposed a limit to the king's command. Memucan answered by imagining a replacement whose conduct would not expose that limit again. The decree was then to be proclaimed throughout the king's vast realm. When women heard it, Memucan argued, they would honor their husbands, from the greatest to the least. As the second banquet had included people from the greatest to the least within Susa's citadel, the proposed law now reached households at every social level. The court treated domestic hierarchy as an imperial concern and expected a royal announcement to reinforce it everywhere. This advice pleased the king and the princes. Their agreement is important because Memucan had spoken to both audiences at once. He gave Ahasuerus a legal answer to public embarrassment, and he gave the officials a policy that promised to protect their authority at home. No one in the recorded consultation questioned whether fear of Vashti's influence was reasonable, whether the law could produce the honor it demanded, or whether her refusal deserved permanent removal. Ahasuerus acted according to Memucan's proposal. Letters were sent to all the royal provinces, adapted to each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language. An empire covering such a range of territories could not govern by issuing a single document in a form most subjects could not read. Imperial communication required scribes capable of rendering a central order for different administrative and linguistic settings while preserving its royal authority. The decree announced that every man should be master in his own household. The final wording also refers to the language of each man's people, though the Hebrew expression is compressed and has been understood in more than one way. At minimum, the order joined household rule to the empire's concern with peoples and languages. A domestic ideal endorsed in Susa was being officially stated to populations with very different customs, histories, and forms of family life. The court solution carried an unavoidable irony. Memucan feared that women would hear of Vashti's refusal and imitate her, so the king informed the entire empire that Vashti had refused him. A moment witnessed by banquet guests became the subject of royal correspondence in every province. The decree punished the queen and asserted male authority, but it also preserved and multiplied the news that the most powerful man in the realm had issued a command inside his own house and had not been obeyed. Once the letters left Susa, the response no longer depended on Vashti's cooperation. That was part of its appeal. The first command had failed because it required her to come. The new command addressed officials and households across the provinces, where others would read, proclaim, or enforce what the king had decided. Ahasuerus could not undo the queen's refusal, but he could control its official consequence and declare how everyone was expected to understand it. The order also transformed a sudden reaction into a durable constraint. A spoken command can be withdrawn after anger passes. A decree written into the laws of Persia and Media was presented as something not to be altered. This feature of royal law will later become dangerous on a far greater scale. Here, it means that the court's answer to Vashti was designed to outlast the mood in which the question first arose. For Vashti, there was no recorded appeal. The men closest to the king had defined her act, measured its supposed danger, recommended her removal, and endorsed a replacement. The process was orderly in form: question, counsel, decree, letters, but the form offered her no voice. Her single refusal was the last action the Hebrew story attributes to her. Everything after it was said and done by men deciding what her refusal meant for them. The empire received a command concerning the authority of husbands, but the immediate effect within the palace was absence. The women's banquet was over. The crown Vashti had been told to wear no longer secured her place. The royal household had defended its hierarchy by removing the woman at its highest female rank, leaving the king with a decree that confirmed his judgment and a queenship with no occupant. Time passed. The account does not say how long, and it does not describe what happened in the provinces when the letters arrived. There is no report of households changing, husbands receiving greater honor, or Memucan's predicted crisis being prevented. The narrative remains with the consequence at Susa. After these events, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti. The statement is restrained. It does not say that he repented, that he wished to restore her, or that he now judged her refusal differently. It says he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. Those three objects of memory belong together. He could think of the woman, but not apart from her act. He could think of her act, but not apart from the legal response he had authorized. Anger had produced quick clarity. An offense had occurred. Advisors had defined its reach, and a decree had supplied the answer. With the anger gone, what remained was more complicated. Vashti was absent, yet the decision removing her had been written precisely so that it would not shift with the king's mood. The law had secured his authority by limiting his options. Remembering her did not bring her back into his presence. The palace now contained a vacancy created by its own defense of royal power. No successor had been selected, despite Memucan's promise that Vashti's position could be given to someone better. The king's officials could not erase what had happened, and they could not safely suggest that the decree had been excessive. They could only move forward from the condition it had created. Somewhere beyond their discussions was the young Jewish woman who would eventually be drawn into that opening. But for the moment, Ahasuerus remembered the queen he had removed and the irreversible judgment that kept her away. The officials around him proposed a way to fill it without challenging anything already done. They suggested that the king appoint commissioners in every province of his kingdom to search for beautiful young virgins. The women would be gathered at Susa and placed in the women's house under the authority of Haggai, the royal eunuch responsible for the women. They would receive the prescribed beauty treatments, and the young woman who pleased the king most would become queen in Vashti's place. This was presented as a practical answer to the king's dissatisfaction. Instead of reconsidering the past, the court would assemble a future from across the empire. Provincial administration would conduct the search, royal officers would gather the candidates, palace staff would prepare them, and Ahasuerus would make the final choice. The same imperial reach that had carried the decree outward could now draw selected young women inward toward Susa. The proposal pleased the king, and he authorized it. The narrative gives no indication that the women were invited to submit applications or that their families could negotiate the terms. Commissioners were to search, and the chosen women were to be gathered. That passive language matters. The process was organized for the king's benefit. Whatever hopes, objections, or fears accompanied those taken into royal custody are not recorded. Within Susa lived a Jewish man named Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, from the tribe of Benjamin. His presence there belonged to a history much older than the current royal search. The text connects his family to the deportation from Jerusalem that occurred when King Jeconiah, also known as Jehoiakim, was carried away by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon along with other Judean captives. The Hebrew wording can be read as attaching that deportation directly to Mordecai, but the chronology points more naturally to Kish or to Mordecai's family line. Jehoiakim's removal took place more than a century before the reign usually associated with Ahasuerus. The narrative's central point is not that Mordecai personally remembered Jerusalem before the exile. It is that his family's life in Persia began with Judah's forced displacement under Babylon. By the time of Ahasuerus, Babylon itself had long since fallen to the Persians. Judean communities remained spread through the lands now governed by the Persian crown, and Mordecai's household was part of that dispersed population. He lived within the imperial capital complex while carrying an identity rooted in a conquered kingdom and a tribe of Israel. That history would not be visible merely by looking at him, but it defined the family into which Esther had been born. Her Hebrew name was Hadassah, and she was also known as Esther. The text uses Esther throughout the action at the Persian court, while preserving Hadassah when she is first identified within her Jewish family. Having more than one name was entirely possible for people living between a minority community and the wider culture around them. The precise origin of the name Esther is debated, but the two names quietly locate her in both settings from the moment she appears. Esther was the daughter of Mordecai's uncle, making her his younger cousin. Both her father and her mother had died. The account does not tell us when they died, how old Esther was when it happened, or what circumstances left her without them. It states the loss plainly, and then describes Mordecai's response. He took her as his own daughter. That act had shaped Esther's life before the royal officers ever came near her. Mordecai was not simply a relative who later advised her from a distance. He had become her parent in practice. His household was the place where the orphan child had been raised, and his authority over her came from a bond formed through care as well as kinship. When the story says she followed his instructions, it is describing an established family relationship rather than a new arrangement created by the palace crisis. Esther had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. The description places her directly within the criteria of the royal search. Nothing is said here about ambition, preparation for court, or a desire to become queen. Her beauty, which had been one part of her life in Mordecai's home, now made her noticeable to officials acting under the king's command. As the decree was proclaimed and many young women were gathered at Susa, Esther was taken into the king's house. The text again uses the language of being taken, not of volunteering. She entered the custody of Haggai, the keeper of the women. The movement was decisive. The young woman Mordecai had raised as a daughter passed from his household into a guarded institution belonging to Ahasuerus. The women's house was not simply a guest residence where candidates waited for an interview. It was part of the royal household, administered by a eunuch, entrusted with access, supplies, attendance, and preparation. Haggai's office placed him between the gathered women and the king. He could not decide who would become queen, but his judgment affected how each woman was housed, treated, and presented within the system. Esther immediately pleased Haggai and won his favor. The Hebrew description conveys kindness or loyal favor shown toward her, a stronger idea than momentary approval of her appearance. The narrative does not identify anything Esther said or did to produce this response. It reports the result. Among the many women brought into the royal house, she became someone the man responsible for them regarded with unusual goodwill. Haggai moved quickly to provide her beauty treatments and her allotted food. These provisions belonged to the official preparation of candidates, not to a routine Esther had chosen for herself. Cosmetics, oils, diet, attendance, and time would all be used to prepare a young woman for one appearance before the king. Haggai's speed ensured that Esther entered that process without delay and with the resources assigned to her. He also gave her 7 chosen young women from the king's house to serve her. Their number and selection distinguished her household within the larger household. Esther had arrived as one of many candidates, but she was now surrounded by attendants drawn from palace staff. These women would help manage her daily needs and treatments, and their presence signaled that Haggai expected her to receive serious consideration. Then he moved Esther and her attendants to the best place in the women's house. The text does not specify what made this location superior. It may have offered better accommodations, greater convenience, or higher status within the internal arrangement. Whatever the physical advantage, the relocation made Haggai's preference visible. Before Esther had appeared before Ahasuerus, she already occupied a favored position under the official who controlled the preparation. Favor, however, did not make her free. She remained inside a process initiated by royal command, and she still had no assurance about its outcome. Her new quarters and attendance increased her prospects while also drawing her more deeply into palace life. Every improvement tied her future more closely to a court that knew nothing about the family and people from which she came. Esther had not disclosed her people or her kindred because Mordecai had instructed her not to reveal them. The text gives the command, but not Mordecai's reasoning. It does not say that Jewish identity had already been outlawed, that Haggai had threatened her, or that the royal search deliberately excluded Jews. It would go beyond the account to supply a specific danger he had discovered. Even so, concealment was possible because identity at this court was not always self-evident. Esther could be known by her Persian name, evaluated for her appearance, placed among women from across the provinces, and accepted without officials recognizing her connection to the Jewish community. Her ancestry was a fact she possessed, but did not announce. Haggai knew her as a favored candidate. He did not know her as the daughter Mordecai had raised, or as a member of a displaced people. Mordecai's command may reflect caution appropriate to life as a minority within an imperial center, but the narrative leaves his calculation unstated. What it makes clear is the result. Esther's advancement began under a divided condition. The palace was learning her face while remaining ignorant of her people. The better she succeeded within the royal system, the more consequential that hidden connection could become. She continued to obey Mordecai as she had when she was under his care. Palace custody had changed their physical relationship without dissolving his parental authority. He could no longer direct her daily life in the same way, but his instruction accompanied her inside. Esther's silence was therefore not presented as an independent scheme for advancement. It was an act of obedience to the man who had raised her. Mordecai, for his part, did not withdraw after she was taken. Every day he walked in front of the courtyard of the women's house to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. He could not simply enter the guarded residence or speak with her whenever he wished. He remained outside, moving near enough to seek news while respecting or being held by the boundaries of the royal household. The daily pattern suggests sustained uncertainty rather than a single anxious visit. Mordecai did not yet know whether Esther's favored treatment would protect her, elevate her, or lead to some other future inside the palace. He watched for information because the process was beyond his control. The man who had once brought Esther into his own home now had to wait outside another man's house to learn what would become of her. No direct conversation between them is recorded during this stage. Information would have depended on whatever access servants, attendants, or palace channels allowed. Yet Mordecai's continued presence meant Esther had not been forgotten by the family outside. Behind her concealed identity stood someone returning day after day, unable to accompany her but unwilling to abandon his watch. Around her the royal search continued. Women gathered from many provinces were placed under the same authority and prepared according to palace requirements. Each had been removed from an earlier life, but the narrative follows Esther because her hidden history and Haggai's favor had already given her position a distinctive tension. She was both conspicuous and unknown. Conspicuous for her beauty and preferred treatment, unknown in the identity Mordecai had ordered her to protect. The court was searching for a woman who could occupy Vashti's place without repeating Vashti's refusal. It did not know that one of its strongest candidates was an orphan descended from Judean exiles, raised by a Benjaminite cousin and still responsive to instruction coming from beyond the palace walls. Esther had entered the royal household under conditions she did not create. Now preparation would reshape her days, and eventually she would have to go before the king who had authorized the search. That appearance would not come quickly. Every woman brought into the royal household had to complete 12 months of preparation before going to Ahasuerus. The schedule was fixed by the regulations for the women: 6 months with oil of myrrh, followed by 6 months with perfumes and other preparations. A candidate's beauty was not considered ready for the king until palace officers had spent a full year shaping how she would be presented. Myrrh was an aromatic resin valued across the ancient Near East, used in oils, perfumes, and treatments for the body. The second 6-month period involved additional spices or fragrant substances and cosmetics belonging to the royal regimen. The text does not explain each treatment or claim that the process changed the women in some extraordinary way. Its purpose in the story is more practical. Entrance to the king was controlled by time, regulation, and the resources of his household. For Esther, those 12 months meant living within a system where nearly every feature of her preparation had been decided in advance. Haggai had accelerated her access to provisions and given her a favorable place, but he could not bypass the required period. Neither beauty nor official preference brought an immediate audience with Ahasuerus. The palace would determine when her turn came. Each woman was allowed one important choice when that turn arrived. Before going from the women's house to the king's palace, she could request whatever she wished to take with her. Clothing, ornaments, cosmetics, or other items available within the household could be supplied. This was her opportunity to shape the impression she would make, though the range of choice still remained inside resources controlled by the king. The visit itself followed an exact and sobering pattern. A woman went to the king in the evening. In the morning, she did not return to the house where the candidates were being prepared. She entered a second women's house under the authority of Xerxes, another royal eunuch, who was responsible for the king's concubines. Her one appearance changed her standing in the palace, whether or not she became queen. Once transferred there, she would not go to the king again unless he delighted in her and summoned her by name. The distinction between the two women's houses reveals the finality beneath the pageantry. Before the evening, a candidate waited for possibility. After it, unless specially called, she became one among the women maintained within the royal household, without regular access to the man whose decision had determined her future. The account does not describe what the candidates said to one another as their turns approached, how they chose what to request, or how those who returned in the morning understood their new place. It keeps the focus on the court's procedure. One woman went in after another, each furnished for a single encounter, each dependent on whether the king remembered her name and desired her presence again. Esther's turn eventually came. She is identified again in relation to the family that the palace did not know. Esther, daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter. Naming her father at this point preserves the ancestry concealed from the court. Abihail was dead, but Esther did not enter the king's presence as a woman without a history. The reader is allowed to carry what Ahasuerus could not see. When she was permitted to choose what she would take, Esther requested nothing except what Haggai advised. The restraint was striking because the procedure allowed her to ask for more. She did not attempt to assemble the most elaborate display she could imagine. She trusted the judgment of the official who understood the palace, the king's expectations, and the effect of every available choice. Haggai's counsel had already improved her position, and now it guided the most important presentation of her life. The text does not list the garments, ornaments, or preparations he selected, so there is no secure basis for reconstructing Esther's appearance that evening. What it emphasizes is her method. Given freedom to request, she relied on informed advice rather than abundance. Esther won favor in the eyes of everyone who saw her. This response extended beyond Haggai, who had favored her from the beginning. The people involved in preparing, attending, and presenting the candidates also regarded her well. Her effect on them is reported without invented conversations or performances. She entered the decisive stage with the goodwill of those around her, though their approval could not determine the king's choice. Her turn came in the 10th month, the month called Tebeth, in the 7th year of Ahasuerus' reign. Tebeth falls in the winter portion of the calendar. The regnal date also shows how much time had passed since the banquet in the king's 3rd year. The story does not account for every month in between or say precisely when the search began, but Vashti's refusal and Esther's appearance before the king were separated by years, not a few hurried weeks. Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in the royal house. This was the point toward which every treatment, provision, and piece of advice had been directed. The text does not narrate the private encounter. It gives no dialogue between Esther and the king, and supplies no details of the night. It moves directly to the judgment that mattered within this system. The king loved Esther more than all the other women. The language of love marks a powerful preference, but the narrative does not develop it into a portrait of courtship or disclose the depth of their personal knowledge. Ahasuerus knew Esther as the woman presented to him after the prescribed preparation. He did not know her Jewish ancestry, her bond with Mordecai, or the obedience that had preserved her silence. His choice was real, but his knowledge of the woman he chose remained sharply limited. Esther obtained grace and favor before him more than any of the other virgins. The king's preference, therefore, went beyond summoning her again as a favored concubine. He placed the royal crown upon her head and made her queen in place of Vashti. The change was immediate and immense. The orphan daughter of Abihail, raised in Mordecai's household, now wore the crown that Vashti had been commanded to wear before the banquet guests. Esther did not receive it through ancestry, diplomacy, or marriage negotiations between royal houses. She reached it through an imperial search that had taken her from home, placed her under Heggai's authority, and submitted her future to the pleasure of Ahasuerus. The court had obtained what it set out to find, a new queen who pleased the king. For Esther, however, the crown did not restore the freedom lost when she was taken into the women's house. It elevated her inside the same structure. She now possessed rank, attendance, and access unavailable to the other women. But those privileges remained governed by royal custom and the will of Ahasuerus. Becoming queen increased her importance without making her independent of the throne. Ahasuerus marked the choice with another great banquet, this one held for all his officials and servants. He called it Esther's banquet. The woman who had entered the palace without disclosing her people now gave her name to a royal celebration attended by the men through whom the empire was governed. Her public identity expanded in a single day from favored candidate to the acknowledged Queen of Persia. The king also granted some form of relief or remission to the provinces. The Hebrew term may refer to a holiday, a release from certain obligations, or another act of royal favor. The account does not specify exactly what burden was lifted. Whatever its administrative form, the gesture connected Esther's elevation to benefits felt beyond Susa. Her coronation became an imperial event rather than a private decision inside the royal household. Ahasuerus distributed gifts according to royal generosity. The celebration followed the pattern of a king whose major decisions were displayed through feasting and abundance. Yet the meaning of this banquet differed from the one at which Vashti had refused him. That earlier gathering ended with an empty place and a legal crisis. Esther's banquet announced that the place had been filled and allowed the court to present the transition as a cause for generosity. Nothing in the festivities disclosed what had made Esther's path possible from her side. The officials could see the new crown, receive the king's gifts, and participate in the public celebration. They did not see the dead parents behind Esther's childhood, the cousin who had adopted her, or the Jewish family line carried from Jerusalem into exile. Those facts remained outside the official story of her selection. Mordecai's role was especially invisible. He had raised Esther, instructed her not to disclose her origins, and stayed near the women's courtyard to learn what happened to her. But he was not publicly presented as the queen's guardian or relative. The king gave no honor to Mordecai at Esther's banquet, because as far as the court knew, Esther's rise had no connection to him. The concealment that had helped her move through the selection now accompanied her onto the throne. Esther did not reveal her kindred or her people. The crown changed how everyone addressed her, where she lived, and how close she stood to imperial power, but it did not change Mordecai's command. She remained known by one part of her identity while guarding the part that joined her to him. That separation created a peculiar arrangement. Mordecai was the nearest thing Esther had to a father, yet their kinship could not be acknowledged as part of her royal position. Esther was the queen, yet the community to which she belonged had no reason to view her elevation as influence at court because her belonging was hidden. The palace had selected her without understanding the connection it had brought inside itself. For the moment, there was no open conflict between that hidden identity and Esther's new office. No law had been issued against her people, and no demand had forced her to choose between silence and disclosure. She could continue obeying Mordecai while carrying out the role Ahasuerus had given her. The arrangement appeared stable because nothing had yet tested it. But queenship in this court was defined by access to a king whose decisions could alter without warning and then harden into law. Esther had gained his favor through one carefully prepared encounter. She had not been shown exercising authority over him or advising him on matters of state. The celebration proved that she had been chosen. It did not prove what she could do if favor and responsibility ever pulled in different directions. Outside the queen's public identity, Mordecai continued his own life within the orbit of the royal compound. Esther's elevation would soon place him where he could hear a threat against the king himself. For now, the court believed its search was complete. Ahasuerus had a queen the empire had been told to celebrate, and the crown rested on a woman whose closest relationship and deepest communal loyalty remained unknown to the man who placed it there. That hidden bond soon became the channel through which a danger inside the palace reached Ahasuerus. At some point after Esther's coronation, young women were gathered a second time. The text does not explain why. It may indicate that recruitment for the royal household continued after the queen had been chosen, but it does not describe another competition for Esther's position or identify the women involved. The unexplained gathering simply fixes the setting for what happened next. By then, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. In a Persian royal complex, the gate was more than an opening in a defensive wall. It was a controlled zone through which officials, petitioners, messengers, supplies, and information passed. Administrative business could be conducted there, and access to its inner spaces reflected recognized standing. Mordecai's presence places him near the working life of the court, though the account has not yet given him high rank. Whether his position existed before Esther's elevation or developed afterward is not stated. The narrative does not say that she appointed him, and such an appointment would have risked exposing the relationship they were concealing. What can be said is that Mordecai was no longer described only as a worried guardian, walking outside the women's courtyard. He now occupied a regular place at the gate, where palace affairs could come within his hearing. Esther still had not revealed her kindred or her people. Her coronation had not cancelled Mordecai's instruction, and the second gathering of women did not prompt her to distinguish herself by announcing her ancestry. She continued to obey Mordecai, as she had while under his care. The wording is notable because Esther was now issuing commands within her own royal sphere. Yet in this relationship, she remained the daughter who respected the man who had raised her. Her obedience did not mean Mordecai controlled every act she performed as queen. The text does not show him sending daily directions into her apartments or using her position for private advantage. It identifies one continuing command. She was not to disclose who her people were or how she was related to him. That guarded fact allowed Mordecai to sit at the gate without being publicly recognized as a member of the queen's family. During those days, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, became angry. They served as keepers of the threshold, a position that placed them near a protected point of entry to the king. Their office required trust. Royal security depended not only on walls and guards, but on the loyalty of those permitted to control the doors closest to the sovereign. The text does not reveal what angered them. There is no account of punishment, rivalry, unpaid service, political allegiance, or personal grievance. Their motive remains unknown, and the story moves immediately to the danger produced by it. Bigthan and Teresh sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. In the language of the narrative, this was a plan to kill him. A plot from threshold guards carried a particular risk because these men already belonged inside the security arrangement. An outside attacker had to pass the doors they guarded. Bigthan and Teresh were stationed at those doors. Their access could bring them near the king, allow them to observe movements within the palace, and perhaps help them choose a moment when ordinary protections were least effective. The threat arose from trusted proximity. Somehow, Mordecai learned of the conspiracy. The narrative does not say whether he overheard the two men, received information from another servant, noticed suspicious activity, or was approached by someone seeking help. It gives him no dramatic confrontation with the conspirators and no private investigation. The essential fact is that knowledge of the plan reached him while he was positioned within the court's gate. Mordecai then told Queen Esther. This movement of information depended on the relationship they were keeping hidden. The story does not explain what messenger carried the warning or how Mordecai contacted her apartments. It does show that concealment had not cut communication completely. He could still reach Esther when the matter was serious enough, and she trusted the report sufficiently to act on it. Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. She did not present the discovery as her own or allow the information to reach Ahasuerus without identifying its source. That attribution was a consequential choice. A queen warning her husband of an assassination plot could have claimed the loyalty and discernment for herself, but Esther preserved Mordecai's role in the official report. She also did not reveal why she trusted him or how closely they were connected. Mordecai could be named as the informant without being named as her guardian and cousin. The report therefore carried one truth into the king's presence while keeping another truth concealed. Ahasuerus learned who had discovered the threat, but he still did not learn what Mordecai was to Esther. The accusation was not accepted without inquiry. The matter was investigated. That step protected the king from acting solely on rumor and protected the court, at least in principle, from accusations used to remove rivals. Royal officials examined the report, and the conspiracy was found to be true. The brief wording suggests confirmation sufficient for judgment, though it does not preserve testimony, evidence, or the method of inquiry. Bigthan and Teresh were both executed. Many English renderings say they were hanged on a gallows, but the expression refers more generally to being hung or displayed on wood, and Persian execution in such cases may have involved impalement. The account does not provide enough detail to reconstruct the procedure with certainty. What it makes unmistakable is that the two threshold guards died for plotting against the king. Their deaths ended the immediate danger. There is no suggestion that additional conspirators remained inside the palace or that Ahasuerus had to flee Susa. The plot was discovered before the men could carry it out, verified through investigation, and answered with public royal justice. Mordecai's information had saved the king's life, even though the story narrates the rescue without ceremony. The incident was then written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. Persian kings relied on scribes and records to preserve administrative actions, tribute, appointments, judgments, and events worth retaining for the court. Within the narrative, the important point is not the exact archival format. It is that the names, accusation, investigation, and outcome entered an official memory larger than any one person's recollection. The record connected Mordecai to an act of proven loyalty. Esther had named him, the investigation had confirmed his report, and the king's own chronicles now preserved the matter. This was not an unverified favor performed privately for the queen. It was service to Ahasuerus himself, documented within the institution that could later establish what had happened and who deserved credit. Yet no reward followed. The king did not summon Mordecai, give him wealth, promote him, grant him a robe, or publicly acknowledge the service. Persian royal culture valued the honoring of benefactors, and the narrative will later show that Ahasuerus expected such service to receive recognition. At this moment, however, the account moves from the writing of the event without recording any response to the man who made it possible. Mordecai did not protest. He did not ask Esther to remind the king, and she did not appear before Ahasuerus to demand compensation for him. The absence of a reward is not treated as a grievance that drives their behavior. Mordecai had acted against a real threat. Esther had carried the warning faithfully, and the conspirators were dead. Their immediate purpose had been accomplished. That restraint preserved the concealment around them. A lavish public reward might have invited questions about how Mordecai gained access to the queen or why she trusted him. Instead, he remained at the gate as the named informant whose deeper connection to Esther was still unknown. His action entered the royal record more visibly than his relationship did. For Esther, the episode was the first recorded use of her position after becoming queen. She did not yet plead for a people, challenge a policy, or make a request that exposed her to danger. She served as the necessary link between information outside the inner royal apartments and the king inside them. Her access allowed Mordecai's knowledge to become an actionable warning. The event also revealed that royal security could depend on people the king had not elevated. Bigthan and Teresh possessed official access and betrayed it. Mordecai lacked comparable status, but used what he learned to protect the throne. Ahasuerus benefited from the loyalty of a Jewish man, whose identity carried no recognized importance at court, and whose service the king did not pause to honor. The contrast was recorded without being resolved. Two trusted guards were exposed as enemies, while an overlooked man at the gate proved faithful. Esther, whose ancestry remained hidden, ensured that the faithful man's name was attached to the deed. The palace knew enough to punish the traitors, but it did not yet understand the significance of the people who had saved the king. Nothing in the account indicates that Mordecai knew his unrewarded service would matter later. A royal chronicle was not a promise about when its contents would be read again. Records could remain untouched while new crises occupied the court. The scribes had secured the event against complete forgetting, but they had not forced Ahasuerus to respond to it. The moment therefore ended quietly. The king lived. The conspirators were gone. Esther remained queen, Mordecai remained at the gate, and the written report remained among the chronicles. No celebration comparable to Esther's banquet marked the prevention of the assassination. Court life continued, leaving a debt of honor on the page, while royal favor moved in another direction. That direction would soon become dangerous. The next man Ahasuerus elevated would not be Mordecai, despite the loyalty just recorded in his name. Power would pass instead to an official whose demand for recognition would collide with Mordecai at the same gate. The forgotten chronicle would remain where the scribes had placed it, waiting through a conflict that began with a promotion the rescuer of the king did not receive. The man was Haman, son of Hammedatha, identified as an Agagite. After these events, Ahasuerus promoted him, raised him above the other officials, and placed his seat higher than that of all the princes with him. No achievement is given to explain the appointment. The king, who had left Mordecai's proven service unrewarded, now bestowed exceptional status on someone the narrative had not previously mentioned. A higher seat was a visible declaration of precedence. Court rank governed access, order, deference, and the distribution of royal favor. Haman was not merely assigned another administrative responsibility. He was elevated so that other princes stood below him, and everyone serving at the king's gate was expected to recognize that distinction. His authority rested on the unmistakable approval of Ahasuerus. The king commanded all the servants at the gate to bow down and prostrate themselves before Haman. The two Hebrew verbs emphasize an act of deep physical deference. In an imperial court, such gestures could express submission to rank rather than worship of a god. The command was directed specifically toward Haman because the king wanted the honor attached to his new position made visible whenever he passed. The gate servants obeyed except Mordecai. He would not bow down or prostrate himself. The narrative gives no speech from Mordecai at the moment of refusal and does not explain his reasoning directly. It would be easy to fill that silence with a familiar religious argument, but the Hebrew text does not say that Mordecai believed every bow before a human being was forbidden. Other biblical Israelites could bow to kings or superiors without treating them as divine. Persian court deference by itself does not fully explain why this Jewish man refused this particular official. The names and family descriptions do add an older resonance. Mordecai had been introduced as a Benjaminite descended from Kish, a name associated in Israel's history with the family of King Saul. Haman is called an Agagite, a title that recalls Agag, king of the Amalekites, whom Saul once failed to destroy as commanded. The biblical memory of Amalek includes deep hostility with Israel, and later readers naturally saw that conflict behind the encounter at the gate. Still, Esther does not pause to establish a complete genealogy from the ancient Agag to Haman, and it does not say that Mordecai announced the old war as his reason. Agagite may function as an ancestral, regional, or deliberately hostile designation, but its exact historical meaning is uncertain. The association intensifies the scene without supplying a private motive the story has chosen not to reveal. What the court could see was much simpler. Haman had received the king's highest favor. The king had issued an order concerning him. The other servants lowered themselves when he passed, and Mordecai remained upright. A disagreement that might have stayed inside Mordecai's thoughts became a repeated public exception at the administrative entrance to the palace. The other servants at the king's gate began questioning him. "Why do you transgress the king's command?" they asked. Their concern was not framed as loyalty to Haman's personality. Mordecai was breaking an order from Ahasuerus, and everyone at the gate worked within a structure where disobedience could have severe consequences. His refusal placed him outside the behavior expected of his colleagues and invited official scrutiny. They spoke to him day after day. This was not a single missed gesture that could be excused as confusion, distraction, or poor timing. Mordecai continued refusing, and the servants continued pressing him. Each encounter gave him another opportunity to comply and made his persistence more deliberate. The gate that had allowed him to discover a threat against the king now became the place where his own conduct was judged against a royal command. Mordecai would not listen to them. He did, however, tell them that he was a Jew. That is the first disclosure of his people recorded at the palace. He had ordered Esther to keep the same identity secret, But when challenged about his refusal, he named it as relevant to his position. The text does not preserve a longer explanation. His answer linked the act to who he was, without explaining every step of his reasoning. The servants decided to report the matter to Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. Their action may have been curiosity, enforcement of palace discipline, or concern that one servant was claiming an exception to the king's rule. Whatever their motive, they carried both facts upward. Mordecai would not bow, and Mordecai identified himself as a Jew. Until then, Haman may not have noticed the one upright man among the servants lowering themselves before him. The report directed his attention toward Mordecai. He watched and saw for himself that Mordecai did not bow down or prostrate himself. The refusal could no longer be treated as gossip among gate officials. Haman now experienced it as a visible denial of the honor his promotion was meant to guarantee. He was filled with fury. The intensity matched the importance he placed on public recognition. Haman possessed rank above the princes and a command from the king requiring others to honor him. Yet one man's refusal became intolerable. He did not respond by asking Mordecai for his reason, challenging his legal claim, or arranging an inquiry into whether Jewish identity allowed an exception. Nor did he immediately strike Mordecai down. Once he had been told what people Mordecai belonged to, Haman considered it beneath him to lay hands on Mordecai alone. The expression does not suggest mercy. Killing one gate servant seemed too small a response to the offense, and too narrow for the status Haman believed had been insulted. Mordecai's disclosure now changed the scale of the danger. The identity he named to explain or define his refusal gave Haman a population to target. Haman began seeking a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. A conflict over one commanded bow became an intention to eliminate men, women, and children who had never stood with Mordecai at the gate. There is no indication that Haman investigated Jewish practices in the provinces or that Jewish communities had organized resistance against royal rule. The only action placed before him was Mordecai's. Haman treated the people as an extension of the man, making shared identity sufficient grounds for shared punishment. The empire's diversity gave him a category spread across many lands. His rage supplied the desire to erase it. This was a decisive change from the earlier response to Vashti. Memucan had also expanded one person's refusal into an empire-wide danger, but his proposed decree sought to reinforce household authority. Haman adopted the same political instinct in a more lethal form. Instead of isolating an offender, he enlarged the offense until an entire people could be presented as the problem. The story does not suggest that Ahasuerus had ordered such an escalation. His command required bowing to Haman. It did not authorize the destruction of Mordecai's people. Haman would need to transform his private purpose into a proposal the king would approve. He had high position and access, but he still needed royal authority to use imperial administration against a population scattered through the provinces. His designation as an Agagite and Mordecai's as a Jew now ceased to be background labels. Haman made peoplehood the organizing principle of his revenge. The dispute would no longer concern whether one servant complied with court etiquette. Every Jew under Ahasuerus became vulnerable because Haman had decided that Mordecai's identity joined them all to his act. Esther belonged to that same people, but Haman did not know it. Her continued obedience to Mordecai's command meant that the highest-ranking Jewish woman in the empire was absent from his calculation. Haman could see Mordecai at the gate and could learn of Jewish communities across the kingdom. Yet he could not see that his intended target extended into the queen's apartments. Mordecai, for his part, had disclosed enough to expose his people without revealing the connection that might have offered access to power. The text does not say that he anticipated Haman's response or warned Esther at this stage. His refusal remained in place, and Haman's purpose developed beyond the public view. Neither the gate servants nor Mordecai is shown hearing that one man's fury had become a plan for mass destruction. The royal court therefore contained two hidden realities moving toward collision. Esther's Jewish identity remained concealed behind her crown, while Haman's intention remained concealed behind his promotion. Ahasuerus saw a favored queen and an honored official. He had no recorded awareness that the official wanted to kill the people to whom the queen belonged. Haman now required more than anger. Destroying a dispersed population would demand a date, a legal charge, written authorization, scribes, provincial officials, and time for commands to reach distant territories. The same imperial structure that could search every province for a queen could also locate and expose a minority within those provinces if the king placed his seal behind the order. Mordecai still sat at the gate where the conflict had begun, refusing the gesture Haman demanded. The forgotten record of his loyalty remained in the chronicles, while the king's newest favorite prepared to turn that loyal man into the reason for an empire-wide sentence. Haman had decided who should die. His next task was to persuade Ahasuerus to let the machinery of Persia do the killing. He began by choosing when. In the first month, called Nisan, during the 12th year of Ahasuerus, a pur, that is a lot, was cast before Haman. The casting continued with reference to the days and months until the result pointed to the 12th month, Adar. The method is not described, but the purpose was to identify the proper time for the action Haman intended. Lots were used in the ancient world to seek a favorable decision beyond ordinary planning, especially when timing mattered. Haman did not ask how quickly the empire could carry out his plan and simply choose the earliest possible day. He submitted the date to a divinatory process and accepted a result near the end of the year. The selected day would later be specified as the 13th of Adar, nearly 11 months after the decree was prepared. The long interval did not soften Haman's purpose. It gave the sentence a distant date on which officials and local populations across the empire could be ready to act together. A scattered people could not be destroyed by one sudden attack in Susa. Orders had to be authenticated, translated, carried to every province, announced publicly, and placed into the hands of those expected to enforce or exploit them. With the date chosen, Haman approached Ahasuerus. He did not begin with Mordecai, the refusal at the gate, or the fury that had made him seek a wider revenge. He told the king that there was a certain people scattered and separated among the peoples in all the provinces of the kingdom. Their laws, he said, were different from those of every other people, and they did not observe the king's laws. The description contained enough truth to sound informed. Jews did live dispersed among other populations, and their inherited laws distinguished them in worship, food, calendar, community, and conduct. But Haman converted difference into collective disobedience. He supplied no examples of rebellion, unpaid tribute, armed resistance, or conspiracy. One Jewish man had disobeyed one command concerning Haman. The king was told that an unnamed people disregarded royal law. Haman concluded that it was not in the king's interest to tolerate them. That sentence made extermination sound like prudent government. He did not say that their continued existence offended him, or that Mordecai had humiliated him. He invited Ahasuerus to see the population as a burden tolerated at royal expense. Once framed that way, removal could be presented as service to the throne rather than satisfaction of Haman's anger. "If it pleases the king," Haman proposed, "let it be decreed that they be destroyed." He then offered to weigh 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who managed the king's business, to be placed in the royal treasury. The amount was enormous. Exact modern conversions depend on the weight standard used, but it represented hundreds of metric tons of silver, a sum large enough to make the proposal financially significant at the highest level. The text does not state whether Haman intended to supply all the silver from his own resources, recover it through confiscation, or use some other means. His later decree would authorize the plunder of Jewish property, but he did not explain the financing to Ahasuerus in the recorded conversation. He simply attached immense revenue to the proposal. The people he wanted dead were thus presented as both politically undesirable and financially profitable to remove. Ahasuerus asked no recorded questions. He did not demand the people's name, summon representatives, inspect their laws, compare Haman's charge with provincial reports, or ask why tolerated communities across 127 provinces had suddenly become a danger. The absence of inquiry is one of the most consequential features of the scene. Haman supplied a category, an accusation, and an offer. The king supplied authority. Ahasuerus removed his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, now explicitly called the enemy of the Jews. A royal signet was not a decorative gift. Pressed into the material sealing a document, it authenticated an order as the king's own. By transferring the ring, Ahasuerus allowed Haman to issue commands carrying royal force without requiring the king to supervise every line. The king told Haman that the silver and the people were given to him to do with as seemed good to him. The wording concerning the money can be understood as allowing Haman to keep it or placing the financial matter at his disposal. In either case, Ahasuerus did not make protection of the unnamed population a condition of the decision. He handed both the proposal and its human subjects to the man seeking their destruction. Haman had concealed his motive, but he no longer needed to conceal his goal. The king's ring gave him what personal rank alone could not, the ability to convert hatred into an imperial act. Mordecai still had not been accused before Ahasuerus, and the Jews had not been heard at all. Their legal fate was placed in the hands of their enemy during a conversation in which the king never spoke their name. On the 13th day of Nisan, the royal scribes were summoned. This was the eve of Passover in the Jewish calendar, though the narrative does not pause to describe observance of the festival. Instead, scribes in the Persian court began producing a command that ordered the destruction of the people whose ancestral calendar gave that month a very different meaning. Haman dictated the decree to the king's satraps, the governors over the provinces, and the officials of each people. These titles reflect layers of imperial administration. Satraps exercised authority over major territories. Governors and local officials carried responsibility closer to particular provinces and populations. The order was designed to reach every level required for coordinated action. It was written to each province in its own script and to each people in its own language. The multilingual work made the sentence locally intelligible without weakening its central authority. A resident far from Susa did not need to understand the language of the royal court to learn what the king had commanded. Scribes turned Haman's purpose into forms that officials and communities throughout the realm could read and proclaim. Every document was written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with his signet ring. Haman may have shaped every instruction, but recipients would encounter the decree as royal law. The king's name erased any administrative distinction between what Ahasuerus had personally formulated and what his chief official had produced under delegated authority. Resistance to Haman's order would therefore be resistance to the king. The letters commanded officials and populations to destroy, kill, and annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, Adar. The accumulation of verbs removed any possibility that the decree called merely for political suppression, expulsion, or punishment of leaders. The target was total, and age or sex offered no exemption. The order also authorized the plunder of Jewish possessions. Those who attacked would not only act under royal permission, they could profit from the victims' homes, goods, and wealth. This provision created a local incentive to participate. Personal greed, old hostility, unpaid debts, neighborhood rivalry, or the simple prospect of taking property could now attach itself to Haman's program under protection of the law. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province and publicly displayed to all peoples so that they would be ready for that day. The victims would live for months with a published date fixed ahead of them. Their neighbors would have the same months to decide whether to join the killing, assist it, await the plunder, or watch the danger grow. The royal couriers went out quickly under the king's command. The decree was also issued within the citadel of Susa. Haman's plan no longer existed only in his thoughts, in the result of the lot, or in his private exchange with Ahasuerus. It was moving outward through official routes while taking legal effect at the center from which it had been sent. The sequence had unfolded with alarming efficiency. The lot was cast in the first month. On the 13th day of that same month, the scribes were assembled. Administrators were addressed, translations were produced, documents were sealed, and couriers departed. The execution date lay far away, but the legal transformation was immediate. Jews who had lived as subjects of Ahasuerus were now subjects marked by Ahasuerus for destruction. Haman's description of them as scattered had helped him accuse them. The decree now used that scattering to expose them everywhere. There was no single Jewish city whose walls could contain the danger or whose surrender could end it. The order reached toward minority communities embedded among many peoples, ensuring that the same date threatened families separated by great distances. Esther was included in the sentence, even though her name appeared nowhere in it. The law did not know that the queen was Jewish, and Haman did not know that his permission extended into the royal house. Her concealed identity protected her from immediate recognition, but it could not remove her from the people the decree defined. The crown had not placed her outside the category. It had only hidden that she belonged within it. When the couriers had been dispatched, the king and Haman sat down to drink. Their calm withdrawal from the administrative work contrasted with the consequence now spreading beyond the palace. Haman had secured the authority he wanted. Ahasuerus behaved as though the matter required no further attention. Neither is shown reading reactions from the provinces or considering individual lives behind the order. The city of Susa was bewildered. Unlike the two men drinking inside the citadel, the wider population met the decree with confusion. The text does not identify who in the city protested, who feared, or who expected to benefit. It records a collective disturbance, the reaction of people confronted by a royal command, whose scale and cruelty could not be absorbed as ordinary government. Mordecai's refusal had now been translated into a death date for every Jew in the empire. 11 months remained before the 13th of Adar, but time alone offered no rescue. The decree carried the king's name, the king's seal, and instructions for the provinces to prepare. Somewhere within the same palace complex sat a queen who had not been named by her enemy, because neither Haman nor Ahasuerus yet knew that the law had sentenced her too. Mordecai learned what had been done. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the middle of the city, crying loudly and bitterly. The man who had refused to lower himself before Haman now appeared in the clothing of grief. He did not hide his response inside his home or confine it to the Jewish community. He carried it into public space where Susa could see and hear him. Tearing garments, wearing rough sackcloth, and placing ashes on the body were established expressions of mourning and calamity in the biblical world. They belonged to moments when ordinary dress and ordinary routines no longer matched what had happened. Mordecai's cry was not a polished address to officials. It was the sound of a man responding to a sentence that had made an entire people eligible for lawful slaughter. He went as far as the front of the king's gate, but he could go no farther because no one dressed in sackcloth was permitted to enter it. The boundary that had once placed Mordecai near useful court information now excluded him in the form he had chosen to wear. Royal space did not receive the visible signs of mourning, even when royal policy had caused the grief outside. Mordecai did not remove the sackcloth to regain entry. He remained before the gate, preserving the public truth of the crisis rather than adapting himself to the palace's standards of appearance. His position was close enough for news of him to travel inside, but not close enough for him to bring his lament directly before Ahasuerus. The law had marked him for death, and court custom kept the evidence of his mourning beyond the threshold. The same response appeared wherever the king's command and decree arrived. In every province there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and lamentation. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. The couriers had carried one message across great distances, and separated Jewish communities answered it in recognizably similar ways. The narrative does not describe armed organization at this stage. It does not show provincial leaders petitioning governors, gathering weapons, or planning escape across the borders. The first recorded response was grief and fasting. The text does not explicitly mention prayer, and throughout the Hebrew story, God is never named. It allows the actions themselves, fasting, mourning, and the later sequence of reversals, to carry their significance without adding a spoken explanation. The danger was now felt far beyond the man who had provoked Haman's fury. Elderly Jews, young families, women, children, merchants, laborers, and servants across the provinces had the same date placed over them. The account does not give them individual names, but their mourning prevents the crisis from remaining an argument between two men at Susa. Haman had made Mordecai's people share his punishment, and they now shared the knowledge of it. Esther's female attendants and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai. Their report caused the queen intense distress. The language suggests that she was seized by anguish, but it is not yet clear how much she knew. Her servants appear to have described Mordecai's condition outside the gate. They may not have explained the full decree or his reasons for mourning, and Esther's first response addressed what she could see through their report: his sackcloth. She sent garments for Mordecai to put on so that he could remove the sackcloth. Proper clothing would have allowed him to pass into spaces from which mourning dress excluded him, and it would have ended the alarming spectacle reported to her. The text does not say whether Esther intended comfort, access, protection from attention, or all of these at once. She tried to change his condition before she understood its cause. Mordecai refused the garments. Clothing suitable for the gate could not answer the decree already moving through the empire. His refusal forced the question deeper. Esther could not solve what was happening by restoring his normal appearance, and he would not let the visible mourning be separated from the danger that required it. The queen then summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs appointed to attend her. Ahasuerus had placed him in Esther's service, which made him an authorized intermediary, capable of moving between her protected quarters and the world beyond them. Esther ordered Hathach to go to Mordecai and learn what this was and why it was happening. That question reveals the limits of her position. Esther wore the crown, but information did not automatically reach her merely because it affected the empire. The decree had been issued in Susa. The city was disturbed, and Jews in every province were mourning. Yet she needed to send a trusted servant beyond her apartments to learn why Mordecai stood in sackcloth. Rank gave her access to messengers. It did not give her complete knowledge. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. The exchange took place outside the guarded royal precinct, in the area where Mordecai's mourning was permitted and visible. Esther remained inside, while her appointed servant crossed the boundary. Neither she nor Mordecai could conveniently cross in person. Mordecai told Hathach everything that had happened to him. He explained the precise amount of silver Haman had promised to weigh into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. The financial detail had not appeared in a public summary alone. Mordecai knew the terms behind the decree. His place near court business may help explain how such information reached him, though the narrative does not identify his source. By describing the matter as what had happened to him, Mordecai connected Haman's policy to the conflict at the gate without reducing the victims to himself. He knew that the decree grew from Haman's response to his refusal, yet his message to Esther did not ask for personal protection. It carried the danger outward toward all the Jews and the money Haman had used to make their destruction attractive to the king. Mordecai also gave Hathach a copy of the written decree issued in Susa. Esther would not have to rely on a distressed relative's account or on palace rumor. She could see the legal text for herself. The copy bore the substance of the order sent through the provinces and showed that the threat was not an angry intention Haman might abandon. It had already become public law. Hathach was to show the document to Esther and explain it to her. This suggests more than simply placing the writing in her hands. The decree belonged to the language and procedures of imperial administration, and Esther needed to understand both what it commanded and what its publication meant. Her protected position had kept the crisis at a distance. Mordecai now supplied evidence that could cross into the women's quarters. Then came his command. Esther was to go to the king, beg his favor, and plead with him on behalf of her people. For the first time, Mordecai's instruction required her concealed identity to shape her public conduct as queen. Until now, he had told her not to reveal her people. That silence had accompanied her through preparation, selection, and coronation. The new decree changed what obedience demanded. The same guardian who had protected the secret now ordered her to act because of the bond the secret contained. He did not yet explicitly tell her to announce, "I am a Jew," but pleading for her people would make continued distance difficult. She could not honestly present the Jews as an unrelated population without weakening the reason Mordecai was sending her. Haman had gained the king's consent by depicting them as a nameless, disposable group. Esther possessed the ability to put a known face near the throne, but doing so could place her inside the sentence she was asking Ahasuerus to overturn. The request also reversed the normal direction of palace favor. Esther had been gathered because the king wanted a woman who pleased him. She had received grace, the crown, a banquet, and public honors through his choice. Mordecai now asked her to use that favor for people the king had already surrendered to Haman. She would have to move from being the beneficiary of royal preference to questioning a decision authenticated in the king's own name. No one could guarantee that Ahasuerus would separate her from the people he had condemned. Haman's accusation had not named individual offenders. It had defined an entire population by difference and alleged disobedience. If Esther disclosed that she belonged to them, the queen herself would become evidence that this certain people existed inside the most intimate circle of the court without the king's knowledge. Mordecai nevertheless treated her position as a responsibility, not merely a refuge. He had no signet, no standing among the princes, and no way to enter the gate in mourning dress. The provincial Jews could fast and lament, but none of them had Esther's proximity to Ahasuerus. The hidden relationship that had protected her at court now made her the only available link between the condemned people and the man whose authority had condemned them. Hathach carried the message back. The path of communication was now complete, from Mordecai in the public square through the royal servant into Esther's quarters. With it came the exact financial offer, the physical copy of the decree, and a direct instruction to intercede. Esther could no longer understand Mordecai's sackcloth as a private sorrow that clean garments might relieve. The document changed her knowledge. Mordecai's command changed her responsibility. Neither change, however, opened the door to the king. Esther was queen, but royal access remained governed by rules that had nothing to do with the urgency of the petitioner's cause. To plead for her people, she would have to approach Ahasuerus under conditions that could turn an attempt to prevent their deaths into the occasion of her own. Esther sent Hathach back with an answer for Mordecai. Everyone who served the king, she said, and everyone throughout the royal provinces knew the law governing entry into the inner court. Any man or woman who approached the king there without being summoned faced one prescribed outcome: death. The only exception came if the king extended the golden scepter, allowing the intruder to live. This was not an obscure palace custom that Esther had learned only after becoming queen. She described it as common knowledge among royal servants and provincial populations. Access to Ahasuerus was controlled by a rule meant to protect both the sovereign's security and the exclusivity of his presence. Rank did not by itself cancel that rule. Esther was speaking as the woman closest to the king in title, yet even she could not assume the right to enter. The golden scepter placed the final decision in Ahasuerus's hand at the moment of approach. Before he extended it, the uninvited person stood under a death sentence. If he chose to receive the visitor, the gesture suspended the penalty and permitted the encounter to continue. There was no intermediate procedure in Esther's description, no opportunity to submit the request first and discover whether its urgency justified her entrance. She then added the fact that made Mordecai's command especially dangerous. She had not been called to go to the king for 30 days. The narrative does not say why. It does not describe a quarrel, a loss of title, or a rival who had displaced her. But a month without a summons meant Esther had no recent evidence that Ahasuerus wanted to see her or would welcome an unexpected appearance. Waiting for a summons offered no reliable solution. The decree's execution date lay months away, but intervention would require time. Haman had already obtained the ring, sent the letters, and made the order public. If Esther remained dependent on the king choosing to call her, she could not determine when she would speak or whether the opportunity would arrive before Haman's policy became impossible to challenge. Her response was therefore not a refusal to care about the Jews. It was an account of the legal barrier between concern and action. Mordecai had told her to enter and plead. Esther told him that entrance itself could kill her before she said a word. The crown gave her potential influence, but the access required to use it depended on the unpredictable mercy of the same king whose decision she needed to oppose. Hathach delivered Esther's words to Mordecai. Their conversation still moved through an intermediary, each message passing between the protected royal quarters and the square beyond the gate. Mordecai could not see Esther's face as he answered, and she could not observe his response. What reached them was language stripped of gesture. Her statement of danger, then his insistence that danger could not be avoided by staying inside. Mordecai told the messenger to answer Esther, "Do not imagine to yourself that in the king's house you will escape any more than all the other Jews. Palace residence might conceal her temporarily, but it could not change who she was. The decree had named a people, not a list of publicly identified individuals. Esther's life depended on a secret that might fail, be exposed, or become impossible to maintain as destruction approached. His warning also removed the comforting idea that safety and silence were the same choice. Esther was not deciding between a dangerous intervention and a secure life as queen. Mordecai understood the king's house as no guaranteed refuge from a law extending to every Jew. Haman had not knowingly targeted Esther, but the scope of his decree had reached her before he knew her name belonged among its victims. Mordecai continued, "If Esther remained silent at this time, relief and deliverance would arise for the Jews from another place." He did not explain what that other place would be. He named no army, governor, foreign ruler, provincial uprising, or hidden ally. He expressed confidence that the survival of the Jews did not depend entirely on Esther, even while insisting that her own responsibility remained. The Hebrew account does not put the name of God into Mordecai's statement. Many readers have heard trust in divine preservation behind his confidence, and the larger biblical story gives reason to understand it that way. Yet, Esther's narrative keeps the source unspoken. Mordecai knows no visible means of deliverance at this moment. He simply refuses to believe that Haman and Ahasuerus have gained final control over the existence of his people. That confidence did not allow Esther to excuse herself. Mordecai warned that if she stayed silent, she and her father's house would perish. The phrase brought her dead father and threatened family line into the decision. She had reached the throne as the daughter of Abihail, though the court did not know it. Mordecai now told her that the household from which she came would not be preserved by a crown worn in secrecy. His statement was not a promise that speaking would save her. Esther had already explained the law, and Mordecai did not deny it. He did not tell her that Ahasuerus certainly loved her enough to extend the scepter, nor did he offer a method for entering safely. His answer was harder. Silence could not secure the future she hoped to protect, and her position carried an obligation even if another source of deliverance ultimately preserved the Jews. Then he asked the question that gathered Esther's entire path into the present crisis. Who knows whether she had attained royalty for a time such as this? Mordecai did not claim to know why each earlier event had occurred. He did not say that Vashti's refusal, the provincial search, Haggai's favor, and Esther's selection had been visibly arranged for one declared purpose. Who knows? Preserved the limit of his knowledge, but the timing could no longer be treated as irrelevant. A Jewish woman occupied the queenship precisely when the Jews needed someone with possible access to the king. The question changed the meaning of Esther's position without pretending to make the outcome certain. Until now, queenship had been something that happened to her through forces she did not control. Mordecai asked whether it had also placed a responsibility in her hands. The question was not whether she had chosen the route to the palace. It was what she would choose now, that the route had brought her here. Esther sent her final answer. She did not repeat the access law, ask Mordecai for another plan, or wait for the king to summon her. Instead, she gave Mordecai instructions. Go and gather all the Jews who could be found in Susa. Fast for her. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. The command drew the Jews of the city into Esther's danger before she publicly identified herself with them. They could not enter the inner court on her behalf, and they could not force Ahasuerus to receive her. They could share the period leading to her approach by refusing food and drink and directing their collective attention toward what she was about to do. Esther and her young women would fast in the same way. Her attendants may not all have been Jewish. The text does not identify their ancestry. Yet the women within her household would join the discipline observed by the Jews outside it. The separation between the queen's quarters and the condemned community would narrow for 3 days through a common bodily act. The fast was not preparation in the form the royal household had once prescribed for Esther. Before her first appearance, she had undergone months of oils, perfumes, cosmetics, and expert advice designed to make her pleasing to the king. Before this approach, she chose abstinence. She would not spend the final days trying to recreate the conditions under which Ahasuerus first favored her. She would enter after sharing the distress of the people for whom she intended to speak. Esther then stated her decision. After the fast, she would go to the king, though it was against the law. She no longer described the danger as a reason she could not obey. She incorporated it into what she had resolved to do. The law remained unchanged. The death penalty remained real, and no summons had arrived. Her action would be deliberate disobedience to the access rule for the sake of challenging the destruction authorized by royal law. And if I perish, I perish. The words did not predict her death, and they did not announce certainty of success. They acknowledged that the outcome lay beyond her control once she entered the court. Esther could choose to approach. She could not choose whether the scepter moved. She could prepare a plea. She could not force the king to hear it. Her decision was complete because it no longer depended on knowing in advance that courage would be rewarded. This was the first moment in which Esther directed the course of the story rather than adapting to a course chosen by others. She had been orphaned, raised by Mordecai, taken into the palace, prepared by Haggai, selected by Ahasuerus, and instructed to conceal her people. Now she assessed the danger, organized a communal fast, included her own household, fixed the time, and accepted the mortal consequence of acting. Mordecai went away and did everything Esther had commanded him. The guardian who had instructed her since childhood now obeyed the queen's direction. He gathered the Jews of Susa, and the fast began. No change occurred in Haman's decree during those days. The couriers were not recalled, the signet was not recovered, and Ahasuerus did not summon Esther. For 3 days, the decision remained active without being tested. Jews outside the palace abstained for the woman hidden inside it, while Esther and her attendants observed the same fast behind guarded walls. When that period ended, explanation would give way to movement. Esther would dress as queen, step toward the inner court without permission, and discover whether the office that had concealed her could become the place from which she spoke. On the 3rd day, Esther clothed herself in royal garments and entered the inner court of the king's palace. The fast was over, but the law had not changed. She did not approach in sackcloth or present herself as a mourner. She appeared in the visible identity the court had given her, dressed as queen, because queenship was the only position from which she could hope to reach Ahasuerus. She stood in the inner court opposite the king's hall. Ahasuerus was seated on his royal throne inside, facing the entrance. The arrangement created a direct line of sight. Esther did not rush toward him, call out from a distance, or attempt to place a petition into another official's hands. She crossed the prohibited boundary and stopped where the king could see that she had come without being summoned. The Hebrew account holds the moment with unusual restraint. It does not describe Esther fainting, as later Greek editions would, nor does it supply a prayer or speech before the king noticed her. She stood in the court, and her life depended on his response. Everything required for judgment was visible. The queen had entered, no summons had been issued, and the scepter remained in the king's hand. When Ahasuerus saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she found favor in his sight. He extended toward her the golden scepter he was holding. The gesture answered the first and most immediate question. Esther would live. She had knowingly entered against the law, but the king chose not to enforce its penalty. The authority that could have ordered her death instead created an exception for her. Before she had explained why she came, favor opened the space in which explanation became possible. Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Her movement completed the formal exchange. She did not remain at a protected distance after receiving mercy. She came nearer and acknowledged the sign by which the king had allowed her entrance. The woman who had spent 3 days preparing to perish now stood alive within speaking distance of Ahasuerus. The king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request?" He recognized that she would not have taken such a risk without a reason. He then offered to grant her petition even up to half of the kingdom. The phrase expressed extravagant royal willingness. It was not a legal promise to divide the empire in two. Ahasuerus was signaling before witnesses that Esther could ask boldly and expect a favorable hearing. This was the opening Mordecai had told her to seek. The king had spared her, invited her to speak, and framed his response in the broadest terms. Esther could have named the Jews, accused Haman, produced the decree, and pleaded for her people immediately. Instead, she asked Ahasuerus to come that day with Haman to a banquet she had prepared for him. The request was modest compared with the offer. Esther did not ask for land, treasure, or an official's removal. She invited the king to dine, and she included the very man whose policy had forced her into the court. Haman would not be summoned as an accused enemy. He would come as the only official invited to share a private royal banquet with the king and queen. The text does not explain why Esther chose this sequence. It does not say that fear silenced her, that she lost confidence at the sight of Ahasuerus, or that she had planned every delay before entering. What can be seen is the effect. Her approach had awakened the king's interest, but her first request did not yet threaten his decision or Haman's position. It moved the conversation into a setting Esther herself had prepared. Ahasuerus ordered that Haman be brought quickly so that Esther's word could be fulfilled. The command carried none of the suspicion that would later surround Haman. From the king's perspective, his queen had risked unsummoned entry to invite him and his highest official to a feast. From Haman's perspective, the summons could only appear to confirm that his exceptional standing extended into the queen's favor. The king and Haman came to Esther's banquet. No other prince is named among the guests. The gathering placed the three people at the center of the hidden conflict around one table. The king who had authorized the decree without naming its victims, the official who had designed it, and the queen who belonged to the people condemned by it. Only Esther understood the full alignment. Ahasuerus did not know why Haman's presence mattered, and Haman did not know why Esther had included him. The banquet therefore depended on unequal knowledge. Haman could enjoy what looked like honor. The king could wait for the request he had been promised. Esther carried the fact that made the meal dangerous to both assumptions. During the wine course, Ahasuerus asked again for her petition. "What is your request?" he said. "It shall be granted you. What is your petition? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be fulfilled." His second offer shows that he did not mistake the banquet itself for the true reason she had entered the inner court. He understood the invitation as an opening move and pressed her to name what she wanted. The repetition also strengthened Esther's position. Ahasuerus had now offered publicly in Haman's presence to grant a substantial request. Haman heard the king commit himself before knowing that the request concerned him. Esther had not accused anyone, but she had secured a setting in which the chief official witnessed the king's eagerness to satisfy her. Esther began, "My petition and my request is this." For a moment, the structure of her answer suggested that disclosure had arrived. She then made her next move conditional on the favor already shown to her. If she had found favor in the king's sight, and if it pleased the king to grant her petition and fulfill her request, then the king and Haman should come to another banquet she would prepare for them the following day. There, she said, she would do as the king had said. She would answer him. The promised petition was postponed for one more day. Esther did not abandon it. She explicitly bound herself to reveal it at the second feast. The king now had both an invitation and an expectation. His curiosity could not close with the first banquet because the reason for her dangerous approach remained unresolved by her own promise. Her language carefully joined personal favor and royal pleasure. "If I have found favor," concerned the king's disposition toward her. "If it pleases the king," concerned his willingness to act. Esther would eventually need both. Affection without action would not save her people, and action without understanding might leave Haman's decree intact. At this stage, she tested neither directly. She secured another hearing. The delay had several immediate consequences, whether or not each was consciously intended. It kept Haman close, rather than allowing him to respond from a distance. It gave Ahasuerus time to think about Esther's undisclosed request. It made the second banquet a royal commitment rather than a spontaneous conversation. And it allowed Haman to leave the first feast believing he had been singled out for extraordinary honor. Esther had also avoided accusing Haman while still under the shadow of her unauthorized entrance. The first question in the inner court had been whether she would live. By the end of the banquet, that question had been answered, and the king had twice invited her petition. When she spoke at the next feast, she would do so not as an intruder awaiting mercy, but as a queen fulfilling the king's repeated command to state her request. Nothing had yet changed for the Jews outside. The decree remained active in every province. The fast had ended, but no public relief followed it. Mordecai had no message that Ahasuerus knew about the danger because Esther had not yet named it. From the perspective of the condemned communities, the appointed day still stood exactly where Haman's lot had placed it, nor had anything changed visibly in Haman's authority. He remained the bearer of the signet, and the official ranked above the princes. Being called to dine alone with the royal couple appeared to add personal intimacy to political power. The Queen's invitation gave him no reason to examine his position defensively. He had not heard the word Jew, and Esther had given no sign that Mordecai was connected to her. Ahasuerus, meanwhile, remained interested but uninformed. He knew Esther wanted something important enough to risk her life, yet he accepted her postponement and agreed to return. The king, who had approved Haman's proposal without investigation, was now being drawn toward a decision through a much slower encounter. Esther had not confronted his negligence, but she had gained his attention in a way the written decree never had. Her method gave the story no simple explanation to settle upon. Perhaps she judged that the moment was not yet right. Perhaps she wanted the king committed more deeply to hearing her. Perhaps the tension of the first approach made delay necessary. The Hebrew text leaves those possibilities open and follows the consequences rather than entering Esther's private thoughts. What matters is that the postponement created time, and time inside this story could carry events no one at the banquet expected. Esther had arranged another meeting for the next day, but the night between the two feasts did not belong to her control. Haman would leave the palace elated, encounter the one man who still denied him honor, and prepare an act of violence he expected to complete before returning to the queen. For now, the first banquet ended with every role still outwardly intact. Ahasuerus was the generous king awaiting a request. Esther was the favored queen promising to speak. Haman was the honored official invited back for a second exclusive feast. Beneath those appearances, the queen had survived the threshold and taken command of the timing. The king still did not know what he had authorized, and Haman still did not know who had begun to place herself between him and his victims. Haman left the palace that day, joyful and glad of heart. The first banquet had given him every reason, as he understood it, to feel secure. He alone had accompanied Ahasuerus to dine with Esther, and the queen had invited him back for the following day. Nothing in her words had exposed hostility. He departed carrying the satisfaction of a man whose political elevation now seemed confirmed by private royal favor. Then he saw Mordecai at the king's gate. Mordecai did not rise before him and did not tremble in his presence. The earlier command had required bowing and prostration. Now the description adds that Mordecai would not even stand or display fear. Haman passed directly from an exclusive meal where his importance had been affirmed to the one place where another man continued to deny its effect. Haman was filled with fury against Mordecai. The encounter changed no law, removed no honor, and threatened no office. Ahasuerus still ranked Haman above the princes, the signet still authorized his acts, and Esther still expected him at her table. Yet the sight of Mordecai upright at the gate entered Haman's joy and displaced it. He controlled himself. That restraint was temporary, but it mattered. Haman did not strike Mordecai in the gate, order nearby servants to seize him, or create a public disturbance outside the palace. He knew that Mordecai occupied a recognized place there, and that execution within the royal administration required more than an angry impulse. Haman left the gate and went home, carrying the offense with him. Once there, he sent for his friends and his wife, Zeresh. The gathering was not called to celebrate the banquet alone. Haman wanted an audience before whom he could review the scale of his success and then explain why it had failed to satisfy him. Those closest to him would hear both the evidence of his greatness and the one grievance he could not absorb. He told them about the glory of his wealth. The narrative does not inventory his property or explain how he acquired it, but his own speech treated riches as proof of significance. Wealth gave visible substance to royal favor and allowed a high official to maintain a household appropriate to his rank. Haman wanted his listeners to measure what he possessed before they considered the man who had insulted him. He also spoke of the multitude of his sons. In that culture, numerous sons represented continuity, strength, and honor within a household. Haman's family would not end with him, and his name seemed secured through the next generation. The sons who appeared in his boast would later be caught within the consequences of his policy. But on this evening, he counted them among the reasons his life should appear complete. Then Haman recounted every way the king had promoted him, and how Ahasuerus had raised him above the officials and servants of the realm. His language gathered separate marks of status into one argument. He had wealth at home, sons to continue his household, and precedence at court. His rank did not depend on rumor. The king himself had made it public and required others to acknowledge it. Haman reserved Esther's invitation as the newest proof. "Even Queen Esther," he told them, "let no one but me come with the king to the banquet she prepared." He emphasized the exclusivity. The feast had not included the other princes above whom he had been raised. It had placed him alone beside the royal couple, and Esther had invited him to return with Ahasuerus the next day. From outside Esther's purpose, the conclusion seemed obvious. Haman had gained the confidence of the king and the favor of the queen. The second invitation suggested that the first was not a ceremonial accident. His household could reasonably hear it as evidence that his position had reached a height few officials could expect. Only after presenting that full account did Haman name what outweighed it. "Yet all this is worth nothing to me," he said, "as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." The statement exposed the scale of his dependence on recognition. Haman did not say Mordecai threatened to take his office, reveal corruption, or turn the king against him. Mordecai's continued presence was enough. Wealth, sons, promotion, and access to the royal table could not satisfy Haman, while one Jewish man remained visible and unafraid. Calling him Mordecai the Jew also showed that the larger hatred had not replaced the personal one. Haman had already arranged for every Jew in the empire to die on the 13th of Adar, but that date was months away. The decree promised eventual destruction of Mordecai with his people. Haman's grievance at the gate demanded a quicker death for the man himself. The distant date chosen by the lot now became intolerable. Each day Mordecai remained at the gate created another opportunity for him to refuse honor. Haman could not enjoy the waiting period required by his own imperial plan, because its original target still appeared before him. He wanted the man removed before Esther's second banquet, so that he could return to the palace without carrying the sight of Mordecai into another royal favor. Zeresh and all Haman's friends offered a solution. They advised him to have a wooden structure made 50 cubits high. Depending on the cubit used, that would be roughly 75 feet, or about 23 meters. The scale far exceeded what was needed merely to kill one man. It would make the intended punishment conspicuous above the surrounding area. Many translations call the structure a gallows, which can suggest hanging by a rope. The Hebrew refers to wood or a tree, and execution in the Persian setting may have involved impalement or the public suspension of a body. The exact method is not described here. The advice was to prepare a towering instrument on which Mordecai could be put to death and displayed. The height suited Haman's need for more than removal. Mordecai had denied him visible honor in a public place. The proposed execution would make Mordecai's defeat publicly visible in return. A structure rising from Haman's property would transform one man's upright refusal into a body elevated only as evidence of Haman's power. Zeresh and the friends told Haman to speak to the king in the morning and have Mordecai put on it. Even with the signet and his dominant position, Haman intended to obtain Ahasuerus' direct approval before executing a servant associated with the royal gate. That request seemed easy. The king had already surrendered Mordecai's entire people to Haman without investigation. Why would he object to the death of one Jewish man? Their advice fitted Haman's schedule precisely. He could go to Ahasuerus early, secure the order, oversee or receive news of Mordecai's death, and then attend Esther's banquet joyfully. The personal obstruction would be gone before the next royal honor. Haman expected the morning to clear the way for an afternoon or evening of undisturbed satisfaction. The proposal pleased him, and he had the structure made. The account does not say who constructed it, how long the work took, or whether Mordecai could see it from the gate. It gives only the completed decision. Before the palace settled into the night, Haman's household had turned his rage into a prepared place of execution. Mordecai had not been tried for a new offense. No charge concerning the assassination plot had been revisited, and the record of his service remained untouched. Haman's intended request would concern the same man who had once protected Ahasuerus, but Haman did not know that history and the king had apparently forgotten it. The planned death depended on that gap in knowledge remaining undisturbed until morning. Esther also knew nothing of the structure as far as the text reveals. She had invited Haman to return and promised to state her petition, but events outside her banquet plan were moving faster than she had arranged. If Haman obtained permission at daybreak, Mordecai could be dead before Esther ever named her people at the second feast. The night therefore brought separate plans into dangerous proximity. Esther intended to speak the next day for all the Jews. Haman intended to begin that day by killing the Jew whose command had sent her to the king. Both expected to approach Ahasuerus, and both needed his response. Esther had secured a promised hearing. Haman relied on established influence. Ahasuerus was unaware of either full purpose. He knew Esther owed him an answer, but he did not know it concerned Haman's decree. He had authorized Jewish destruction, but he did not know Haman's immediate hatred of Mordecai. He had once benefited from Mordecai's warning, but the service had never become part of the living relationship between them. Haman went toward the night believing the decisive arrangement was already made. The structure stood ready, his household supported the plan, and he needed only a brief royal command in the morning. After that, he expected to leave Mordecai's body behind and take his place again beside the king and queen. The obstacle was not an opponent assembling guards or preparing an appeal. It was a written entry, resting among the royal chronicles. Years earlier, scribes had recorded Mordecai's name because Esther had insisted on giving him credit. Haman could plan the morning, but he could not control what occupied the king before morning came. That night, Ahasuerus could not sleep. Sleep fled from the king. The text gives no cause. Ahasuerus had not been told about the structure outside Haman's house, and Esther had not disclosed the request awaiting him at her second banquet. Nothing in the account suggests that anxiety about Mordecai or the Jews kept him awake. The king simply could not sleep, and he responded by ordering that the book of memorable deeds, the royal chronicles, be brought and read aloud to him. Court records could preserve more than dry lists of taxes and appointments. They kept acts of service, threats against the throne, judgments, and matters that might later require royal attention. Ahasuerus did not ask for a particular year or incident. Servants opened the record and began reading in his presence, allowing the stored business of the reign to supply what the night had withheld. They came upon the report concerning Mordecai. It stated that he had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, and had sought to lay hands on Ahasuerus. The record contained the danger, the names of the traitors, and the identity of the man whose warning prevented the attack. What had once passed without ceremony now entered the king's hearing at the precise moment Haman wanted that man dead. Ahasuerus asked, "What honor or distinction has been given to Mordecai for this?" The attendants serving him answered, "Nothing has been done for him." Their reply revealed an unfinished obligation within the royal system. Mordecai's service had not been disputed or forgotten by the archive. It had simply never produced the recognition appropriate to it. The king did not ask whether Mordecai still deserved honor after refusing to bow to Haman, because that conflict was not part of what he knew. He saw a proven act of loyalty with no corresponding reward. Before deciding what to do, Ahasuerus asked who was in the court. Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace. He had arrived to speak to the king about having Mordecai put to death on the wooden structure prepared for him. The man whose name had risen from the chronicles was, at that instant, the target of the official waiting outside. The timing placed Haman exactly where the king needed an advisor. He was early because he wanted to control the morning, and his eagerness made him available for a question he had not anticipated. Ahasuerus' servants reported that Haman was standing in the court, and the king ordered them to bring him in. Haman entered expecting to request Mordecai's execution. He was not given the first word. Ahasuerus asked him, "What should be done for the man whom the king delights to honor?" The king did not name Mordecai. He framed the matter as a question of royal honor, inviting Haman to design the most fitting public reward. Haman heard the phrase, "the man whom the king delights to honor," and interpreted it through everything he had told his household the evening before. His wealth, rank, precedence, and exclusive invitations made one answer seem obvious to him. "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" Haman said in his heart. That assumption determined his advice. He did not propose silver, land, another office, or private praise. He chose the visible symbols most closely associated with the king himself. Let royal robes be brought, garments the king had worn. Let a horse be brought on which the king had ridden, bearing the royal crown or insignia on its head. Clothing worn by the king carried a significance beyond expense. To place it temporarily on another man was to wrap him in a sign of royal identity under direct authorization. The king's own horse extended that association into public movement. Haman imagined an honor that would allow the chosen man to appear throughout Susa, marked by the personal favor of Ahasuerus. He continued, "The robe and horse should be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. That prince should dress the honored man, lead him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" The proposal required a high official to serve as herald and attendant. The noble prince would not ride. He would walk ahead, guiding the horse and announcing another man's distinction. Haman may have imagined himself seated while someone beneath his current rank led him through the city. He designed the scene from the position he expected to occupy within it. Ahasuerus approved the plan immediately. "Hurry," he told Haman. "Take the robe and the horse, just as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have spoken." The name overturned every expectation Haman had carried into the room. He had come to ask that Mordecai be raised on wood as a condemned man. The king ordered him instead to raise Mordecai onto the royal horse as an honored servant. He had wanted a public display of Mordecai's defeat. He was now required to create a public display of Mordecai's favor. Ahasuerus's description also showed that the king knew where Mordecai could be found and identified him as the Jew. The ethnic identity Haman used as the basis for destruction now accompanied Mordecai's royal honor. Yet the king still did not connect that identity to the decree he had sealed. He could reward one Jewish man while remaining unaware that he had authorized the death of all Jews, including the man he was about to honor. Haman had no room to revise his recommendation. The king repeated its details and commanded haste. Nor could Haman safely explain that he had arrived to request the death of the very man whose loyalty had just been read aloud. To oppose Mordecai now would expose a private hostility against someone Ahasuerus had publicly chosen to reward. So Haman took the robe and the horse. He dressed Mordecai and led him through the city square. The official, ranked above all the princes, walked before the gate servant who had never bowed to him. As they moved, Haman proclaimed the words he had written for his own imagined triumph. "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." The city that had been bewildered by the decree now witnessed a Jewish man clothed in royal garments and conducted publicly by the author of that decree. The parade did not cancel the sentence against the Jews, and no one is shown interpreting it as rescue. Its meaning was immediate and personal. Ahasuerus had chosen Mordecai for distinction, and Haman had been forced to announce it. Mordecai did not use the honor to claim a new office or extend the procession. When it ended, he returned to the king's gate. The royal robe and horse belonged to the ceremony, not to a permanent transfer of rank. Mordecai resumed his place where the conflict had begun, now publicly marked as a man whose service the king valued. Haman hurried to his house mourning, with his head covered. The outward signs of grief had moved from Mordecai to him. Earlier, Mordecai wore sackcloth and cried through Susa because Haman had obtained a decree against the Jews. Now Haman concealed his head and rushed away because he had been made the herald of Mordecai's honor. The structure prepared for Mordecai still stood. Haman had not secured permission to use it, and the mourning had made such a request far more dangerous. Asking Ahasuerus to execute Mordecai immediately after honoring him would challenge the king's judgment and raise questions Haman had hoped to avoid. His plan had not merely been delayed, its intended victim had become publicly protected by royal favor. Haman told Xerxes and all his friends everything that had happened. The previous evening they had listened to his inventory of success and designed a way to remove the one source of dissatisfaction. Now they heard how the king's question had trapped Haman inside his own pride, how he had named the highest honor he could imagine, and how every element had been given to Mordecai instead. His advisors are now called his wise men, suggesting that this circle claimed more than friendly sympathy. Together with Xerxes, they drew a conclusion from the reversal. If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not prevail against him. You will surely fall before him. Their warning was striking, because they already knew Mordecai was Jewish when they recommended the execution structure. That identity had seemed to make him contemptible and vulnerable. After the parade, it became the reason they expected Haman's defeat. One morning had altered their reading of the same fact. They did not explain the basis of their certainty. Perhaps they recognized a pattern in which Haman's attempt to destroy Mordecai had produced Mordecai's elevation and Haman's humiliation. Perhaps they knew something of Jewish survival within the empire, or interpreted the reversal as an omen. The text gives their conclusion, not their method. Haman had begun to fall, and they no longer believed he could stop the movement. There was no time for him to answer. While they were still speaking, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to Esther's banquet. The meal that had seemed like the summit of his favor now came immediately after his public disgrace and his household's prediction of ruin. Haman could not cancel the invitation, remove the structure, rebuild his confidence, or prepare Ahasuerus for what he might hear. Palace servants took control of the schedule and brought him back to the royal couple. Esther was ready to answer the king's question. Ahasuerus had spent the night discovering that Mordecai deserved honor, and Haman entered the second banquet, knowing for the first time that his power might already be turning against him. The king and Haman took their places with Esther, and as wine was served on the second day, Ahasuerus asked for the third time, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Even to half of the kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Esther had brought him to this question by stages. First, she had crossed into the inner court, then invited him to one banquet, and then asked him to return for another. Now, the king repeated his promise in front of Haman, exactly as Esther had said he would. She had survived the approach, secured his attention, and placed her enemy within hearing. There was no further delay. "If I have found favor in your sight, O king," Esther answered, "and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request." She began with her life. Ahasuerus had thought he was being asked to grant some royal favor. He now learned that the queen believed herself in mortal danger. Esther joined her request to the personal favor the king had already shown. The woman he had crowned and repeatedly promised to satisfy was asking not for additional privilege, but permission to remain alive. Then she joined her life to the lives of her people. This was the disclosure the palace had never received. Esther did not identify the endangered population at first by its name. She identified it through relationship, my people. The king knew the queen before he knew the group, so Haman's anonymous category entered the conversation through someone Ahasuerus valued. Esther continued, "For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated." She used the language of the decree, repeating its accumulated terms for total destruction. Her wording also recalled the financial transaction attached to Haman's proposal. Haman had offered silver, and Ahasuerus had placed the people at his disposal. Esther described the result from the side of those sold. Ahasuerus had heard Haman speak of a scattered people whose laws differed from those of others, and whose continued presence did not benefit the king. He now heard that the policy concerned the queen's life. Esther did not let him keep the proposal at the level of administration. The verbs written to distant governors were brought into the banquet room and attached to the woman sitting before him. "If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves," Esther said, "I would have remained silent. Enslavement would itself have been a disaster, but she used it as the lesser outcome to clarify the scale of what had actually been ordered. She had not risked approaching the throne over a temporary burden or a change of status. The decree demanded that no one among her people remain alive." Her next phrase is difficult in Hebrew, but its force concerns the loss to the king. The adversary could not compensate for the damage being done. The destruction of Esther and her people was not truly in Ahasuerus' interest, whatever payment Haman had offered. Esther answered the very argument Haman had used. He had claimed that tolerating the people brought the king no profit. She warned that eliminating them would impose a loss no adversary could repay. She still did not begin by blaming Ahasuerus. The documents carried his name, and his hand had transferred the signet, but Esther framed the crisis so that the king could now act as the protector whose interests had been deceived. This did not erase his responsibility. It gave him a way to reverse allegiance without first requiring him to confess that he had authorized mass killing without investigation. Ahasuerus responded, "Who is he and where is he who has dared to do this?" His question suggests that he had not connected Esther's words with the decree he approved. Haman had never named the Jews in the recorded conversation, and the king had entrusted the details to him. Now Ahasuerus treated the threat to Esther as an offense committed by another person, demanding the identity and location of the man bold enough to endanger his queen. Esther answered, "An adversary and an enemy, this wicked Haman." The accusation landed with Haman seated before her. He was not a distant official who could be summoned later or warned in time to construct a defense. Esther named him while he sat between the king whose authority he had used and the queen whose identity he had failed to discover. His invitation had never been proof that Esther favored him. It had placed him where accusation and judgment could meet without delay. Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The official who had entered the first banquet, confident of exclusive honor, now understood why Esther had gathered these three people together. He also understood the morning's reversal differently. Mordecai was not only a Jewish gate servant, unexpectedly honored by the king, he was connected to the people the queen had just claimed as her own. Ahasuerus rose from the wine banquet in fury and went into the palace garden. The text does not tell us what he considered there. He may have needed distance from Haman, time to grasp his own role, or a moment to decide the punishment. What is clear is that he left without acquitting Haman, and Haman recognized that the king had determined disaster against him. Haman remained behind to beg Esther for his life. He did not follow Ahasuerus into the garden, accuse Esther of concealment, or defend the decree as lawful policy. The man who had shown no concern for the lives of an entire people now appealed to one of those people to preserve his own. His future depended on mercy from the woman he had unknowingly sold to destruction. Esther was reclining on a banquet couch, as guests did at such meals. In the desperation of his plea, Haman fell upon the couch where she was. The action may have been an attempt to come close enough to beg urgently, not an attempt to attack her. But court boundaries around the queen were strict, and Haman had placed himself in a position that could be interpreted in the worst possible way. Ahasuerus returned from the palace garden and saw Haman on Esther's couch. "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" the king demanded. The accusation removed the last possibility of Haman recovering his position. Ahasuerus now saw him not merely as an official whose policy threatened Esther from afar, but as a man violating her space before the king's eyes. Whether Haman intended assault no longer controlled the meaning of the scene. The king named what he saw, and his words became judgment. As soon as the words left the king's mouth, attendants covered Haman's face. The gesture marked the fall of a man no longer permitted to stand openly before the sovereign. Haman had entered the banquet ranked above the princes and carrying recent authority to act in Ahasuerus' name. He left the king's favor before he ever left the room. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, spoke. He pointed out that a wooden structure 50 cubits high stood at Haman's house. Haman had prepared it for Mordecai, Harbona said, the man who had spoken good for the king. The information joined the banquet accusation to the discovery made during the sleepless night. Ahasuerus now learned that Haman had planned to execute the very man he had just honored for saving his life. Haman appeared as an enemy on both sides of the throne. He had condemned the queen and her people, and he had prepared death for the king's proven benefactor. Harbonah's knowledge also showed that Haman's private plan was no longer private. The towering structure had been built to make Mordecai's death conspicuous, and its intended purpose had reached a palace eunuch before Haman could secure permission. Haman had designed a public answer to one man's refusal. The court could now use that design as evidence against him. Ahasuerus gave a short command: hang him on it. There was no new investigation like the one conducted for Bigthan and Teresh. Haman had been accused by the queen, caught begging on her couch, and exposed as the man preparing to kill Mordecai. His protection depended on royal favor, and that favor had vanished. The instrument waiting at his house supplied an immediate means of punishment. Haman was executed on the structure he had prepared for Mordecai. The exact procedure remains the same as when it was first proposed, likely impalement or suspension on the wood, rather than the later image of a rope gallows. The method matters less than the reversal the text states plainly. Haman had ordered it built to make Mordecai's defeat visible, and his own body became its display. Then the king's fury subsided. The central room of the conflict had changed in a single banquet. Esther's identity was no longer hidden from Ahasuerus. Haman's motive had been exposed. Mordecai remained alive at the gate, while the official who sought his immediate death was gone. Esther had spoken, and the man who sold her people had received the punishment prepared for her guardian. But Haman's execution did not call back a single courier. The decree did not depend on his continued life once it had been written in the king's name and sealed with the royal signet. Provincial officials still possessed instructions for the 13th of Adar, and local enemies still had permission to kill and plunder Jews on that day. Ahasuerus's anger could end when Haman died because the personal offender had been removed from his presence. Esther's crisis could not end there. She had won judgment against the enemy at the banquet, but her request concerned both her own life and her people. The first had become visible to the king. The second remained bound beneath a law Haman no longer needed to be alive to enforce. That same day, Ahasuerus gave Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. An executed official's house included more than the physical residence where the structure had been built. It encompassed property, wealth, servants, and the resources attached to his household. The man who had offered silver in exchange for Jewish destruction lost everything he owned to the Jewish queen he had condemned. Mordecai then came before the king because Esther had revealed how he was related to her. The concealed bond was finally made part of court knowledge. Ahasuerus learned that the man whose warning had saved his life and the queen whose plea had exposed Haman belonged to the same family. Mordecai was not merely a Jewish servant at the gate. He was the guardian who had raised Esther. The king removed the signet ring he had recovered from Haman and gave it to Mordecai. Authority once delegated to the architect of the decree now passed to the man whose refusal had provoked it. The transfer did not automatically invalidate anything Haman had sealed, but it gave Mordecai power to authenticate new commands in the king's name. Esther placed Mordecai over Haman's estate. He would administer the property of the enemy who had planned to display his body outside that same household. The reversal was substantial. Haman was dead. His wealth belonged to Esther, his office had lost its power, and his signet was on Mordecai's hand. Yet none of these changes had altered the instructions already held by officials across the empire. Esther therefore spoke before the king again. She fell at his feet, wept, and begged him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the scheme he had devised against the Jews. At the banquet, she had spoken with controlled formality before naming Haman. Now that he was gone, the continuing decree drew an openly distressed appeal from her. Ahasuerus extended the golden scepter toward Esther, and she rose to stand before him. The gesture again granted her a hearing. This time Mordecai's presence and the disclosure of their relationship had changed the setting, but Esther still approached the king through the formal mercy symbolized by the scepter. Her rank did not allow her simply to issue a correction on her own. "If it pleases the king," she said, "and if I have found favor before him, and if the matter seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces." Esther appealed to every basis available to her: the king's pleasure, his favor toward her, the justice of the matter, and their personal relationship. She was not asking only for Haman to be judged differently now that his motive was known. She asked for his letters to be recalled. The written sentence had to be addressed in the same administrative realm where it continued to exist. "How can I endure," she asked, "to see the disaster that will come upon my people? How can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred?" Her questions made clear why personal rescue and property could not satisfy the petition. Esther could not accept safety as an individual exception while watching the decree consume the community she had claimed. The relationship once hidden for her protection now defined what she refused to survive alone. Ahasuerus answered Esther and Mordecai together. He pointed first to what he had already done. Haman's estate had been given to Esther, and Haman had been executed because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. The king now described Haman's offense in terms of the entire people, not merely the threat to the queen or the planned death of Mordecai. Then he gave them authority to write concerning the Jews as they saw fit in the king's name, and seal the document with the royal signet. But he added the legal obstacle Esther's request had reached. A writing issued in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring could not be revoked. The rule meant that Ahasuerus would not simply withdraw Haman's letters and declare them void. The first decree remained an authenticated expression of royal authority even after the king learned it had been obtained through manipulation. Persian law, as Esther presents it, protected the finality of the king's written word at the cost of making a mistaken command extraordinarily difficult to repair. The solution would therefore be a second decree, equal in authority and directed against the effect of the first. It could not erase the order allowing enemies to attack the Jews, but it could authorize the Jews to organize, arm themselves, and resist. Survival would not come through cancellation. It would come through a new legal position on the same appointed day. The royal scribes were summoned on the 23rd day of the third month, called Sivan. More than 2 months had passed since Haman called them on the 13th of Nisan. During that interval, his decree had continued circulating and settling into provincial plans. Now, the scribes returned to the administrative task, with Mordecai directing the message. The new order was written to the Jews and to the satraps, governors, and officials of all 127 provinces from India to Kush. As before, each province received the document in its own script, and each people in its own language. This time, the Jews also received it in their own script and language, ensuring that the threatened communities could understand their newly granted rights directly. Mordecai wrote in the name of Ahasuerus and sealed the decree with the king's signet ring. Couriers carried it on swift horses bred for royal service. The speed reflected the urgency. The execution date remained months away, but communities needed time to receive the command, coordinate across cities, prepare defenses, and understand that resistance would no longer be treated as rebellion against the crown. The decree granted Jews in every city the right to assemble and stand for their lives. They were authorized to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force of any people or province that attacked them. including the attackers' women and children, and to plunder their possessions. Its language deliberately matched the severity of Haman's order while directing action against those who would carry out the assault. The permission was defensive in its stated trigger. The Jews could act against forces that attacked them. But it contemplated a violent struggle in which households and property could be caught within the consequences. The second decree did not turn the 13th of Adar into a peaceful day. It transformed the Jews from legally helpless targets into a population permitted to gather and fight back. Mordecai fixed the action for the same day appointed by Haman's decree, the 13th day of the 12th month, Adar. He did not choose an earlier date for a separate campaign. Both commands would meet on the day selected by the Pur. Enemies could act under the first law. Jews could defend themselves under the second. The result would depend on preparation, numbers, alliances, leadership, and how provincial officials understood the king's present favor. Copies of Mordecai's document were issued as law in every province and publicly proclaimed to all peoples. The Jews were to be ready for that day to take vengeance on their enemies. The message was not hidden within palace archives. Those who had learned that Jews could be killed and plundered now learned that the same Jews were authorized to assemble against their attackers under a decree bearing the same royal seal. The couriers rode out quickly under the king's command, and the order was issued in the citadel of Susa. The machinery once used by Haman now carried Mordecai's answer. Scribes, translators, provincial officials, royal horses, and public proclamations served a policy that did not depend on persuading every local enemy to abandon hatred. It made attacking the Jews legally dangerous. Mordecai left the king's presence wearing royal robes of blue and white, a great golden crown, and a mantle of fine linen and purple. The man who had returned to the gate after one temporary parade now emerged with the durable appearance of high office. Haman had once counted elevation above the princes among his greatest honors. Mordecai now carried visible authority associated with the king himself. The city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. When Haman's decree had been issued, the city was bewildered, while Haman and Ahasuerus drank. Mordecai's decree produced the opposite public response. The wider population recognized that the balance of court favor had changed, and that change affected how people evaluated the coming conflict. For the Jews, there was light, gladness, joy, and honor. In every province and city reached by the new command, they held feasts and celebrations. The execution date had not disappeared, but despair was no longer their only possible response. They possessed time, legal standing, and public evidence that the king's highest official now belonged to their people. Many among the peoples of the land declared themselves Jews or attached themselves to the Jewish community because fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. The Hebrew expression can suggest adopting Jewish identity or publicly aligning with the Jews. The exact depth of those changes is not described. In either case, people who had once seen the Jews as exposed now considered association with them safer than opposition. Fear had begun to move before any battle took place. Provincial leaders knew Mordecai's name and rank. Local populations knew the Jews could lawfully gather. Potential attackers knew that plunder was no longer risk-free. The first decree still invited violence, but the second altered every calculation surrounding it. Esther had gained more than an exception for herself. Mordecai had gained more than Haman's office. Together, they had placed the empire's authority behind the right of their people to survive the assault already authorized against them. Yet the two decrees remained side by side, neither erased, each pointing towards the same day. The 13th of Adar would reveal whether Haman's purpose could still prevail after all the power that once supported him had passed into the hands of his intended victims. When the 13th of Adar arrived, both royal decrees took effect. The enemies of the Jews had expected that day to give them mastery, But the situation was reversed. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. The date selected by Haman's lot remained unchanged. What changed was who entered it prepared, protected by law, and supported by the officials responsible for carrying out the king's will. Jews assembled in their cities throughout all the provinces of Ahasuerus to attack those seeking their harm. No one could stand against them, because fear of them had fallen upon the surrounding peoples. The satraps, governors, provincial officials, and royal administrators helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them as well. Mordecai was now powerful within the king's house, and reports of his rank had spread through the provinces. His authority was not confined to an impressive robe in Susa. Officials far from the capital understood that the man directing the second decree stood near Ahasuerus and continued to grow in power. Helping the Jews had become the course aligned with the court's present leadership. The Jews struck those who sought their destruction. The text describes killing by the sword and a great defeat of their enemies, allowing the Jews to do what they wished to those who hated them. This was violent deliverance, not the quiet disappearance of Haman's order. The first decree had prepared enemies to kill Jewish families. The second allowed those families to organize and meet force with force. Inside the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed 500 men. The royal stronghold where the policy began contained a substantial body of active enemies even after Haman's death and Mordecai's elevation. Court favor had changed, but hostility had not vanished. The fighting reached the center from which the two contradictory laws had been sent. The 10 sons of Haman were among those killed: Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, and Vaizatha. Their deaths ended the household Haman had once counted among the proofs of his greatness. The family that stood to inherit his name and position fell within the conflict their father had created. Yet the Jews did not lay hands on the plunder. Haman's decree had invited attackers to enrich themselves from Jewish property, and Mordecai's counter-decree had granted the Jews the same legal right against their enemies. They declined to use it. The repeated refusal distinguishes survival and vengeance from a campaign organized to seize the wealth of those defeated. That day, the number killed in the citadel was reported to Ahasuerus. The king told Esther that the Jews had killed 500 men in Susa and the 10 sons of Haman. If that had happened in the citadel, he asked, what must they have done throughout the rest of the provinces? Then he invited another petition. What is your request? It shall be granted. What more do you seek? It shall be done. Esther asked that the Jews in Susa be permitted to act again the next day under the same authorization, and that the bodies of Haman's 10 sons be displayed on the wooden structure. The text does not explain why she believed a second day was necessary in the capital. It presents her request without naming additional plots or estimating the enemies who remained. Ahasuerus granted it. A new order was issued in Susa, and Haman's sons were displayed. The structure originally prepared for Mordecai now bore the dead household of the man who built it. Haman's intended spectacle had been reversed completely. Mordecai lived in royal authority, while the line Haman had celebrated became a public sign of his defeat. On the 14th of Adar, the Jews in Susa assembled again and killed 300 men. Once again, they took no plunder. Across the 2 days, 800 men died in the capital complex, in addition to Haman's sons. The survival of the Jews there came through a severe confrontation sustained beyond the day originally fixed for the attack. In the other provinces, the fighting followed the first day's schedule. The Jews assembled, stood for their lives, and gained relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of those who hated them. The number records the enormous reach of the conflict across the empire. Haman's accusation had endangered a dispersed population everywhere, and the resistance occurred on the same imperial scale. For the third time, the account states that the Jews did not take the plunder. The point is not incidental. Property had been written into both decrees, but it did not become the reward the Jews carried away. Their enemies were defeated, yet the houses and possessions of the dead were not treated as the object of the day. The provincial Jews fought on the 13th and rested on the 14th, making it a day of feasting and gladness. The Jews of Susa, having fought on both the 13th and 14th, rested on the 15th. Their difference in dates came from the extra day Esther requested, not from competing accounts of when the danger ended. In villages and unwalled towns, the 14th of Adar became a holiday marked by gladness, feasting, and the sending of portions of food to one another. The practices grew directly from the movement of the story. A people who had fasted under a sentence of death now ate together after surviving it. Those once scattered by geography exchanged gifts within their communities as participants in one deliverance. Mordecai wrote down these events and sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of Ahasuerus, both near and far. The man whose earlier act of loyalty had waited unnoticed in a royal record now created a record for his own people. His letters were not limited to officials or the residents of Susa. They carried the meaning of the days across the same distances Haman's decree had traveled. He instructed the Jews to observe the 14th and 15th days of Adar every year. These were the days on which they gained relief from their enemies, and the month in which sorrow was turned to gladness and mourning into a holiday. The annual observance would include feasting, rejoicing, sending food to one another, and giving gifts to the poor. The inclusion of the poor ensured that the celebration did not depend on personal wealth. A household with abundance could send portions. A household without it was not to be excluded from the shared gladness. Deliverance would be remembered through food crossing social boundaries, not only through a court ceremony honoring Esther and Mordecai. The Jews accepted these customs and continued what they had begun. The days were called Purim, from Pur, the lot Haman had cast. He had used the lot to determine the most favorable time to destroy them. The name of that instrument now belonged to the annual commemoration of the day his purpose failed. Mordecai's letters explained the reversal. Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, enemy of all the Jews, had plotted to destroy them and cast the Pur for their ruin. When the matter came before the king, Haman's evil plan returned upon his own head, and he and his sons were displayed on the wood. The story of Purim preserved not only escape, but the collapse of the plan upon its author. Esther and Mordecai then used their full authority to confirm the observance. Esther was named not merely as the queen beside Mordecai, but as the daughter of Abihail, bringing her family identity into the public record from which it had once been concealed. Together, they sent a second letter concerning Purim with words of peace and truth to the Jews throughout the 127 provinces. The days were established for the appointed times. Along with the practices of fasting and lamentation, the Jews had accepted for themselves and their descendants. Celebration did not erase the grief that preceded it. The memory included both the fasting performed under threat and the feasting that followed relief. Esther's command confirmed the regulations, and they were written in a book. The survival of the Jews would not depend on one generation remembering the details accurately through conversation alone. The dates, practices, and reason for the observance entered a durable communal record. Ahasuerus later imposed tribute on the land and the coastlands of the sea. His reign continued as an imperial reign with taxation, administration, and the exercise of power. The Jews had not left Persia, overthrown its throne, or regained an independent kingdom through Esther's intervention. They survived within the empire whose laws had nearly destroyed them. The acts of Ahasuerus's power and the full account of Mordecai's greatness were written in the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia. Mordecai became second in rank to Ahasuerus. He was great among the Jews and well regarded by many of his people, seeking their good and speaking for the welfare of all their descendants. That is where the Hebrew story leaves Esther and Mordecai, not beyond the reach of imperial power, but no longer hidden and helpless within it. The orphan had become queen, disclosed the identity that once protected her through concealment, and used her access to keep her people alive. Mordecai had moved from the gate to the place beside the throne, carrying their welfare into the work of government. And each year, when Adar returned, the old death date brought a different movement through Jewish homes. Portions of food passed from one household to another, gifts reached the poor, and 2 days once reserved for annihilation arrived instead with the sound of people feasting because they were still there.